The bullet that shattered the St. Louis hotel window wasn't meant for Vivian Calder, but the three men climbing the fire escape absolutely were. Heart hammering, silk skirts bunched in trembling fists, she hurled herself through the back door into an alley reeking of rotted fruit and desperation. Behind her, wood splintered. Voices shouted her dead husband's name, then hers. She had exactly one chance: the westbound train leaving in 11 minutes, and a stolen ticket bearing someone else's name. As steam hissed and iron wheels began their slow groan forward, Vivian Calder made a choice that would unravel everything or save her life. If you've ever fought for a second chance you didn't deserve, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey reaches. The Montana Territory sprawled wild and merciless under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow hope whole. Iron Creek Ranch sat at the edge of that vastness, 2,000 acres of rough grassland carved from wilderness by a man who understood that survival meant bleeding into the soil until it finally yielded. Colton Hayes had built every fence post, birthed every calf, and buried the dreams that didn't survive the winters. At 42, his hands bore the map of that labor: scarred knuckles, rope-burned palms, and fingers that had forgotten gentleness. He stood now at the depot platform, hat brim pulled low against the August glare, watching the eastern horizon where the train would appear. The practical blue cotton dress he'd requested sat folded in tissue paper back at the ranch house. The advertisement he'd placed in the Boston Matrimonial News had been specific: seeking sensible woman of good character, must value hard work over luxury, companionship and partnership in building a frontier life. He'd received 4 responses. He'd chosen Margaret Ann Thornton, a schoolteacher from Connecticut, 34 years old, unattached, seeking purposeful employment and modest security. The letters had been brief, practical, exactly what he needed. No flowery romance, no impossible expectations. Just 2 adults constructing a reasonable arrangement against the loneliness that could break a person as surely as drought broke the land. Except Margaret Ann Thornton didn't exist. The train's whistle screamed across the valley, and Colton straightened, squaring shoulders that carried the weight of 100 disappointments. Around him, Iron Creek's platform buzzed with the usual chaos: ranch hands collecting supply orders, the postmaster's wife gossiping with the minister's daughter, children darting between luggage carts. The locomotive thundered into the station trailing coal smoke and the acrid scent of hot metal, brakes shrieking against iron rails. Passengers descended. A cattle buyer Colton recognized. 2 families heading to homesteads further west. An aging prospector who'd probably die broke and frozen before spring. Colton scanned faces, looking for the sensible woman with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, the one who'd written that she preferred function to fashion and valued honesty above all else. Then she appeared in the train car doorway, and every word in those letters turned to ash. Vivian Calder wore emerald silk that caught the brutal sunlight and threw it back like a challenge. The dress cinched a waist so small it seemed engineered for ballrooms, not frontier depots, and the fabric whispered expensive secrets with every movement. Beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with actual peacock feathers, her face was all sharp angles and darker secrets: high cheekbones, full lips pressed tight with something between fear and defiance, and eyes that scanned the platform with the desperate wariness of a deer circled by wolves. She carried a single carpet bag that looked as out of place as she did, rich leather tooled with designs Colton associated with the kind of money that bought politicians and destroyed lives. As her foot touched Montana soil, she stumbled slightly, and Colton saw the terror flash across her features before she locked it down behind a mask of brittle composure. The platform went quiet. Not all at once, but in spreading ripples as people noticed her. Noticed the way she didn't belong. Noticed the kind of trouble that arrived dressed in silk. Colton's jaw clenched hard enough to hurt. This wasn't a mistake. This was something worse. She spotted him, probably the only man standing alone, clearly waiting, clearly furious, and walked toward him with steps that tried for confidence but betrayed themselves in slight trembles. Up close, he could see the exhaustion bruising shadows beneath her eyes, the way her gloved hands gripped the carpetbag handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Mr. Hayes?" Her voice carried Eastern finishing school polish over something raw and frightened. Not Margaret Thornton. Colton's words came out flat and hard. Around them, he felt the attention of the entire platform, ears straining to catch this confrontation. So who the hell are you? Color drained from her face, leaving her pale as winter bone. She swallowed, glanced around at the watching crowd, then met his eyes with something like desperate courage. Could we perhaps discuss this somewhere more private? No. Colton didn't move, didn't soften. You got something to say it here. I don't do business with liars in shadows. For a heartbeat, he thought she might bolt, just turn and run back onto that train. Her eyes darted to the locomotive, still hissing steam, still capable of carrying her away. Then something hardened in her expression, some last reserve of pride or foolishness that made her lift her chin and speak words that would change everything. My name is Vivian Calder. Margaret Thornton was my... She hesitated, choosing carefully. My companion. She helped me write the letters. I paid her passage west on the condition that she come in my place, but the night before departure she disappeared with the money, so I came instead. She drew a shaking breath. I'm sorry for the deception, Mr. Hayes. I'm sorry for all of it, but I had nowhere else to go. The silence that followed could have frozen blood. Colton stared at her, fury and disgust warring with something dangerously close to pity. Behind him, he heard Mrs. Henderson gasp. The postmaster's wife. Within an hour, every soul in Iron Creek would know that Colton Hayes had been swindled by some fancy woman running from whatever hell she'd created back east. You had nowhere to go, he repeated, voice low and dangerous. So you committed fraud, stole another woman's identity, lied in every word of every letter. Yes. To her credit, she didn't flinch. All of that is true. What are you running from? Now she did flinch. Her throat worked, and he saw genuine terror flash through those dark eyes before she wrestled it down. Debts. Dangerous debts. Men who will... She stopped, seemed to realize she was saying too much in front of too many ears. Men who mean me harm. So you brought that harm here. To my doorstep. To my town. I brought myself, she said quietly. Nothing more. I swear it. Colton laughed, the sound bitter as alkali water. A woman swear who just admitted to lying about everything. That's worth a lot. He turned away, dismissing her as he'd dismiss a cheating card dealer. Train leaves in 20 minutes. I suggest you're on it. There's nowhere safe for me to go. He stopped, looked back over his shoulder. Then you should have made different choices. Mr. Hayes. Colton. Please. She took a step forward, and he saw the desperation crack through the finishing school veneer. I'll work. I'll earn my passage. I won't ask for charity or marriage. Just a chance to what? To what? He spun back, anger finally breaking loose. To hide on my ranch while whoever's chasing you burns it down around us? To play at being a frontier wife while having no damn idea what that means? He gestured at her dress, at the impractical hat, at everything she represented. You think this is some adventure? Some romantic escape? This land kills people who were born to it. What do you think it'll do to someone like you? The words hit her like physical blows, and he watched her absorb each one, spine straightening with each impact instead of breaking. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something fierce and quiet. I think it will probably kill me, but at least I'll die free. The admission hung in the hot air between them, raw and honest in a way that made Colton's anger stumble. Before he could respond, Reverend Michaels materialized at his elbow, face creased with concern and the particular kind of meddling that came from genuine goodness. Colton, perhaps we should... No, Reverend. Colton didn't take his eyes off Vivian. This is ranch business. This is a woman in distress, the Reverend said firmly, which makes it everyone's business. He turned to Vivian, voice gentling. Miss Calder, was it? I'm Reverend Michaels. Perhaps you'd like to wait at the church while matters are settled? Vivian's expression flickered with something like gratitude before Colton cut through it. Matters are settled. She's leaving. He pulled a money clip from his vest pocket, counted out $20, more than enough to get her wherever the rails ran, and held it out. Take it. Find someplace else to hide. She stared at the money like it was a snake. I don't want your charity. You want my ranch even less, believe me." When she didn't move to take it, Colton grabbed her hand, felt the fine leather of her glove, the delicate bones beneath, and pressed the bills into her palm. Her fingers were trembling. "This is the only kindness you'll get from me. Use it or don't. I don't care." He released her hand and walked away, boot heels loud on the platform boards. Behind him, he heard the Reverend's murmured attempts at comfort, heard Vivian's soft thanks in that cultured voice that didn't belong anywhere near Montana. He didn't look back. The ride to Iron Creek Ranch took 40 minutes through country that would have been beautiful if Colton hadn't been too furious to see it. Rolling grassland stretched to the mountains, dotted with his cattle. A hard-won herd that represented 15 years of unrelenting labor. The ranch house appeared on the horizon, 2 stories of solid timber and stone with a wide porch built to watch sunsets from. He'd added that porch 3 years ago, thinking maybe someday there'd be someone to watch them with. Now that porch would stay empty, and he had only himself to blame for being fool enough to hope. Rafael Mendoza, his foreman and the closest thing he had to a friend, met him at the barn. One look at Colton's face and Rafael grimaced. "That bad?" "Worse." Colton swung down from his horse, handed over the reins. "Con artist. Fraud. Showed up wearing a dress worth more than most homesteads, running from debts and dangerous men." Rafael whistled low. "She pretty?" "What the hell does that matter?" "Means you noticed." "I noticed she wasn't Margaret Thornton," Colton snapped. "I noticed she lied about everything. I gave her train fare and sent her packing." "So she's gone." Colton turned toward the house, jaw set. "She will be, soon as that train leaves." But the certainty in his voice felt hollow, and the memory of those dark, desperate eyes lingered like smoke he couldn't quite clear from his chest. In Iron Creek, population 243 souls, news traveled faster than wildfire and burned just as destructive. By nightfall, every household knew that Colton Hayes had been bamboozled by some silk-wearing harlot from back east. The story grew in the telling. She was a thief, a murderer, a ruined woman fleeing scandal. She was an actress, a gambler's wife, a madam closing down a failed brothel. Vivian Calder heard none of these stories directly. She sat in a small room above the general store that Mrs. Henderson had grudgingly rented her for $2 a week, watching the sun bleed out over the Montana horizon. The room held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that wouldn't quite close. It was the plainest space she'd occupied in 15 years, and somehow that felt like justice. She'd counted Colton's money 3 times. $20. Maybe enough to reach San Francisco if she was careful. Maybe enough to disappear into some city where her past couldn't follow. But cities were where she'd failed before. Cities were where Marcus Calder had found her, married her, and dragged her into debt so deep she'd watched them swallow everything, her jewelry, her dignity, his life. When the gambling creditors came for final payment after Marcus put a bullet through his own skull rather than face them, they'd made it clear. They'd take their money from her flesh if necessary. She'd run with nothing but the clothes she wore and a desperate plan involving a mail-order bride advertisement and a borrowed name. She'd thought Montana meant safety. She'd thought a rancher needed someone practical enough not to ask too many questions. She'd been wrong about everything except the part where she had nowhere else to go. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find Reverend Michaels holding a basket covered with gingham cloth. "Miss Calder, may I come in?" She stepped aside, and he entered with the careful awareness of a man observing proprieties. He set the basket on the washstand: bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of preserves. The church maintains provisions for travelers in need. "I'm not a traveler," Vivian said quietly. "I'm a liar who got caught. You're a woman who made desperate choices." The Reverend's eyes held kindness but also assessment. "Mr. Hayes is angry, and he has right to be. But anger fades. The question is what you do while it does." "He gave me money to leave." "And yet you're still here." Vivian turned back to the window, watching lamplight bloom in distant ranch houses. "I keep trying to make myself get back on that train. But then I think about where it leads, and—" She stopped, unwilling to voice the fear that haunted her. "I can't go back east, and I don't know anywhere else." "Then perhaps you stay and build something here." She laughed, the sound broken. "With what?" I have no skills for this place, no strength, no... You have determination enough to come 2,000 miles on a lie. That's something. Reverend Michaels moved to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. This town judges harshly, but also forgives earned. Prove yourself honest from here forward, and you might be surprised what becomes possible. After he left, Vivian stood alone in the gathering dark, holding an apple from the charity basket. Through the thin walls, she heard Mrs. Henderson below, voice carrying up through floorboards. Won't last a week. Mark my words, Judith, that kind never does. Vivian bit into the apple, tasting both sweetness and shame. Then she walked to the small mirror above the washstand and studied the woman staring back, pale, frightened, draped in silk that suddenly felt like a costume from someone else's life. She began unpacking her carpet bag, not to prepare for leaving, but to inventory what staying might cost. Morning arrived with brutal sunlight and the realization that $20 wouldn't last forever. Vivian descended to the general store to find Mrs. Henderson sweeping the porch with aggressive strokes, each swish of the broom a judgment. I'd like to inquire about work, Vivian said, forcing her voice steady. Perhaps clerking, or I run a respectable establishment. Mrs. Henderson didn't pause in her sweeping. Don't need the kind of help that comes with scandal attached. I see. Vivian swallowed the humiliation rising in her throat. Is there anywhere in town that might... You could try the schoolhouse. Miss Porter mentioned needing someone to help with the younger children, but I doubt she'll... Mrs. Henderson finally looked up, eyes hard. You ain't what you pretended to be, Miss Calder. That kind of dishonesty taints everything it touches. Best you move on before the taint spreads. Vivian felt the words like brands, but she kept her spine straight. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Henderson. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a whitewashed building that seemed to glow with optimistic defiance against the rough frontier sprawling around it. Inside, Vivian found organized chaos. 20 children of varying ages crammed into rows of desks, and a young woman with ink-stained fingers trying to teach multiplication while simultaneously settling a dispute over a stolen pencil. Miss Sarah Porter looked up at Vivian's entrance, and her expression cycled through surprise, recognition, and wary assessment in rapid succession. Miss Calder. Miss Porter, I apologize for interrupting. I heard you might need assistance with the children. Sarah set down her chalk, wiped her hands on her apron. You heard correctly. But I should be clear, this isn't paying work. It's volunteer service to the community. I understand. And given... Sarah hesitated, choosing words carefully in front of 20 pairs of listening ears. Given recent events, there may be parents who object to your presence. I understand that as well. Vivian met her eyes squarely. But I need to prove myself honest work, Miss Porter. If you'll allow me the chance, I'll do whatever tasks you assign without complaint. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, you can start by helping the youngest group with their letters. Primer level, alphabet, and basic phonics. The work was harder than Vivian expected. The children, ages 5 to 7, possessed energy that seemed supernatural and an attention span measured in seconds. By noon, her head pounded from the noise, her throat ached from repetition, and her expensive silk dress bore chalk dust and what appeared to be jam from lunch distribution. But she'd helped 3 children master the letter M, and when young Timothy Fletcher finally connected the sound to the symbol, his face had lit with such pure joy that something in Vivian's chest cracked open. She returned the next day, and the next. By the end of the week, Sarah Porter's wariness had thawed to cautious approval, and Vivian had learned that frontier children had no mercy for pretense. They responded to consistency, fairness, and the willingness to sit on rough floors to meet them at eye level. Her silk dresses, impractical and increasingly damaged, began to be replaced by simpler calico she purchased from Mrs. Henderson's store with carefully counted coins. The transformation felt like shedding skin, painful and necessary. She took additional work where she could find it, washing linens for the boarding house, mending clothes for ranch hands who lacked wives to do it, scrubbing floors at the church. The labor blistered her hands and exhausted her body in ways that ballrooms and finishing schools had never prepared her for. At night, She collapsed into her narrow bed with muscles screaming and fell into dreamless sleep too deep for nightmares. But she didn't leave. And slowly, grudgingly, Iron Creek began to notice. 3 weeks after Vivian's arrival, Colton Hayes rode into town for supplies and found himself watching her carry water buckets from the town pump to the schoolhouse. She'd traded the emerald silk for plain brown calico, and her hair, which had arrived arranged in elaborate curls, was now pulled back in a simple braid. The peacock feather hat had vanished, replaced by a plain sunbonnet. She looked like she belonged, which made Colton angrier than her arrival had. Raphael appeared at his elbow, following his gaze. "That's her? That's her? Doesn't look like a con artist." "That's how con artists work." Colton turned away, heading for the general store. But Raphael's voice followed. "Word is she's been helping at the school, working honest jobs. Hasn't caused any trouble. Yet. You're determined to hate her." "I'm determined not to be a fool twice." Colton pushed through the store door, ending the conversation. But inside he found Mrs. Henderson in rare form. "Won't say she hasn't worked hard," the older woman was telling the minister's wife. "But hard work don't erase lies. My Henry says she's still hiding something, mark my words." Colton gathered his supplies in silence, but the conversation needled him. Because the truth was, he'd been watching Vivian Calder more than he cared to admit. Watching her stumble through tasks that should have been beyond her, watching her accept humiliation without complaint, watching her transform from silk-wrapped deception into something that looked dangerously like genuine effort. It didn't change what she'd done, but it complicated his anger in ways that made him want to ride hard until the feeling exhausted itself. That evening, as he worked on fence repairs with Raphael, his foreman finally spoke what Colton had been avoiding. "You ever think maybe she really did have nowhere else to go?" Colton drove a post into hard ground with vicious force. "Don't matter. She lied. People lie when they're desperate. Or when they're criminals. You know what she is?" The question hung unanswered because Colton didn't know. Didn't want to know. Knowing would require caring, and caring about Vivian Calder would be the stupidest thing he'd done since believing those letters in the first place. He changed the subject to cattle prices and herd rotation, and Raphael let him. But the question remained, stubborn as thistle. Iched. The storm arrived on a Tuesday in late September, building through the morning like divine fury gathering strength. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, and the wind carried the sharp, cold promise of early snow. In the schoolhouse, Sarah Porter watched the darkening horizon with growing anxiety. "We should dismiss early," she told Vivian. "Get the children home before it hits." They sent the students out in groups, the oldest shepherding the youngest toward homes and ranches scattered across the valley. But as the last group departed, Sarah did a head count and went pale. "The Fletcher children and Mary Davidson, they're not here." Vivian looked around the empty classroom, confusion tightening her chest. "What do you mean?" "They must have left early, probably went exploring instead of heading home." Sarah's voice climbed with panic. "They do that sometimes, play in the old Miller homestead, but in this weather—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Through the window, the first snow began to fall, thick and fast, erasing the world in white. Within an hour, Iron Creek erupted into organized chaos. Men gathered at the church, ranchers, ranch hands, anyone who could ride and shoot and navigate a whiteout. Colton arrived on horseback, face grim, as he organized search parties with the efficiency of a man who'd faced frontier emergencies before. Vivian stood on the church steps, watching the preparations, feeling utterly useless, until she heard the locations they planned to search. "The Miller place is half a mile southeast," one rancher was saying. "There's the old Hendricks claim to the north." "What about the root cellar?" Vivian's voice cut through the planning, and every head turned toward her. She felt the weight of their stares, but pushed forward. "The old storm shelter past Cottonwood Creek. I heard the children talking about it last week. They said it was their secret hideout." Colton's eyes locked on hers, sharp with assessment. "You know where it is?" She'd heard the children describe it, had even drawn them a map when they asked about geography. "Yes, I think so." Thinking isn't good enough. Not in this. But even as he spoke, she saw him calculating, saw the desperation that came from knowing children's lives hung in the balance. "You sure?" Vivian met his gaze and made a choice between safety and truth. "I can find it." "Then you're riding with me." The announcement sent ripples through the gathered men. Riding out into a Montana blizzard was dangerous enough. Riding with an inexperienced Eastern woman who might be wrong about the location bordered on suicide. "Colton, she can't," someone started. "She's the best lead we've got." Colton was already moving toward his horse. "Anyone else remember the children mentioning that cellar?" Silence confirmed what Vivian had already known. Children told her things they didn't share with adults who'd known them all their lives. It was the one gift her weeks of patient listening had earned. Raphael appeared with a horse, a steady mare named Dulcie, and helped Vivian mount. She'd ridden exactly 3 times in her life, all of them in controlled parks with proper saddles and calm weather. This was something else entirely. "Stay close," Colton ordered, already wheeling his gelding toward the southeast. "If you fall behind, I'm not coming back for you." Then they were riding into white hell, and Vivian discovered what it meant to be truly afraid. The wind hit like fists, driving snow into every exposed inch of skin. Within minutes, she couldn't feel her face. Within 5 minutes, she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. She clung to Dulcie with desperate strength, trusting the mare's instincts more than her own, trying to keep Colton's dark shape in view through the blizzard. He looked back once, checking she was still there, and she saw something shift in his expression, maybe surprised that she hadn't already given up. Then he turned forward again, and they pushed deeper into the storm. Time lost meaning. There was only wind and cold and the relentless need to stay in the saddle. Vivian's teeth chattered so hard she thought they might shatter. Her hands, even in gloves, had gone numb and useless. She held on through will alone. Then Colton stopped, and she nearly rode past him before Dulcie halted on her own. Through the snow, Vivian could barely make out what he was looking at, a depression in the ground, a tumble of old timber barely visible beneath accumulating drifts. "This it?" His voice was nearly lost to the wind. Vivian stared, trying to match the landscape to the children's excited descriptions. The cottonwood trees should be there. Yes, barely visible. The old fence posts, there. And the entrance. "Yes," she shouted back. "The door faces east, should be—" She never finished. Colton was already dismounting, dropping to his knees in the snow, digging with bare hands at the drift covering what looked like random debris. Then she saw it, the corner of a wooden door buried under snow and years of neglect. "Help me!" Vivian half fell from Dulcie's back and crawled to where Colton dug with frantic strength. Together they clawed at the snow, fingers burning with cold, until they'd cleared enough to wrench the door open. Darkness yawned beneath, and for one terrible moment, Vivian thought they'd guessed wrong. Then a small voice rose from the black. "Mr. Hayes?" 3 children huddled together in the cellar's corner, Timothy Fletcher, his sister Emma, and Mary Davidson, all of them shaking with cold and terror but alive. Alive. Colton dropped into the cellar without hesitation, gathering them up with gentle efficiency that contrasted sharply with his earlier harshness. He handed them up to Vivian one by one, and she wrapped them in the blanket Raphael had insisted she carry, holding them close and whispering reassurances while Colton climbed out. "Can you ride holding one?" he asked, already lifting Emma toward her. "Yes." Vivian had no idea if it was true, but she'd make it true. She'd ride through the devil's own storm, if that's what these children needed. Colton settled Timothy in front of him and gave Mary to Vivian, along with Emma. 2 small bodies pressed against her, trusting her completely, and Vivian felt something fierce and protective bloom in her chest. Something that had nothing to do with proving herself and everything to do with getting these children home safe. The ride back was worse than the ride out. The children's weight made balance precarious, and the storm had intensified to near whiteout conditions. But Colton rode close now, shouting directions when needed, and once when Vivian started to slip sideways, his hand shot out and steadied her without a word. When they finally emerged from the storm's worst fury and saw the lights of Iron Creek ahead, Vivian could have wept with relief. Instead, she held the children tighter and whispered, "Almost there. You're safe now. Almost home." The entire town seemed to pour into the street as they arrived. Parents ran forward with cries of joy and terror, pulling their children from the horses and into desperate embraces. Someone wrapped a blanket around Vivian's shoulders. Someone else led Dulcie away. The world became a blur of noise and relief and bone-deep exhaustion. Through it all, Colton stood silent, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Then Margaret Fletcher, Timothy and Emma's mother, broke from her children long enough to grip Vivian's hands with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Oh, dear Lord, thank you. Sarah told me you knew where they'd be. You saved them. You saved my babies." Vivian tried to speak, to explain it had been Colton who'd done the saving, but her throat closed around words she couldn't form. She simply held the other woman's hands and let herself be pulled into an embrace that felt like forgiveness. Later, much later, as the celebration of the children's safe return filled the church, and Vivian sat quietly in a corner trying to stop shaking, Colton Hayes appeared with 2 cups of hot coffee. He handed her one without speaking and stood there, snow still melting in his hair, studying her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see through every wall she'd ever built. "You could have died out there," he finally said. "So could you." "I know what I'm doing. You barely know how to ride." "I know how to hold on." Vivian sipped the coffee, letting the heat seep into her frozen core. That seemed enough. Colton's jaw worked, and she braced for another lecture about her foolishness, her inadequacy, all the ways she didn't belong. Instead, he said something that hit harder than any criticism. "That was brave. Stupid, but brave. Is there a difference out here?" "Not usually." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Vivian holding her coffee and wondering if something had just shifted or if the cold had simply frozen her ability to think clearly. Around her, Iron Creek celebrated life snatched back from winter's jaws. And for the first time since the train had delivered her to this impossible place, Vivian Calder allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found somewhere worth fighting to stay. The storm raged outside, but inside the church, surrounded by people who'd started to look at her with something other than suspicion, Vivian felt the first fragile warmth of something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. The week following the storm brought changes that rippled through Iron Creek like stones dropped in still water. Margaret Fletcher insisted on paying Vivian for tutoring her children, pressing coins into her hand with a fierce gratitude that wouldn't accept refusal. Others followed. Families who'd watched their children return safely began to see past the silk-wearing stranger to the woman who'd ridden into a blizzard without hesitation. The whispers didn't stop entirely, but they shifted tone, traded edges for something softer. Vivian felt the change most acutely in small moments. Mrs. Henderson nodded to her on the street instead of looking away. The blacksmith's wife brought her a jar of preserved peaches with a gruff, "For helping with the young ones." Even Reverend Michaels seemed pleased in a way that suggested he'd witnessed a small miracle of human redemption. But Colton Hayes remained a wall of silence. She'd see him occasionally when he came to town for supplies, always distant, always careful to keep physical and conversational space between them. Once their eyes met across the street, and for a heartbeat something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the ghost of the understanding they'd shared in that storm. Then he'd tipped his hat with cold politeness and turned away, leaving Vivian with the unsettling awareness that one act of courage hadn't erased the lies that brought her here. She told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't trying to win Colton Hayes' approval. She was trying to build a life from the wreckage of her old one, and that required looking forward, not backward at a rancher who'd made his feelings abundantly clear. Still, on the nights when exhaustion gave way to something lonelier, she'd remember the warmth of his hand steadying her in the blizzard, the quiet strength in his voice when he'd called her brave, and wonder what might have been possible if she'd arrived as the woman she'd pretended to be instead of the fraud she was. October arrived with crisp mornings and the restless energy of a frontier town preparing for winter. Vivian had settled into a rhythm, teaching at the schoolhouse 4 days a week, taking in sewing and mending, helping Sarah Porter with lesson planning in exchange for meals. It wasn't prosperity, but it was honest, and honesty felt like luxury after years of Marcus Calder's debts and deceptions. She was mending a ranch hand's torn shirt on the boarding house porch when Rafael Mendoza rode up, his weathered face creased with concern that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Miss Calder, need to ask you something." Vivian set down her needle, pulse quickening. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong exactly. Raphael dismounted, hat in hand, displaying the kind of discomfort men showed when asking for help they'd rather handle themselves. It's my sister Lucia. She's having her first baby, and the midwife, Mrs. Carson, she's down with fever, can't travel. And Lucia, she's... He stopped, jaw working. It's not going well. The baby's turned wrong, and she's scared, and I know you're not a midwife, but I thought maybe... Where is she? Vivian was already standing, her sewing falling forgotten to the porch boards. Mendoza Homestead, 10 miles northwest. Raphael's relief was palpable. But Miss Calder, I should warn you, it's bad, real bad. If you'd rather not... How long has she been laboring? Since yesterday morning. 24 hours. Vivian's limited knowledge of childbirth, gleaned from her mother's work with Philadelphia's charity hospital, told her that was dangerously long. She thought of turning wrong babies and the complications that could kill both mother and child, and fear spiked through her chest. She had no business attempting this. No training beyond watching her mother assist doctors. No confidence that she wouldn't make everything worse. Then she thought of Lucia Mendoza, young, frightened, laboring alone while her baby struggled, and the fear transformed into something fiercer. I'll need clean linens, hot water, and someone who can follow instructions without questioning them. Raphael's face flooded with gratitude. Colton's already there. He went when I asked him to fetch you initially, figured Lucia shouldn't be alone. The information hit Vivian like a physical impact. Of course Colton would be there. Of course he'd go without hesitation to help someone in need, displaying the exact compassion he'd withheld from her. The unfairness of it stung, but she shoved the feeling down. This wasn't about her wounded pride. This was about a woman and baby who needed help more than they needed Vivian's complicated feelings about the man already providing it. Then let's not waste time talking. The ride to the Mendoza homestead taught Vivian that she'd learned more about horseback riding than she'd realized. Dulcie responded to her commands with patient efficiency, and Vivian found herself able to focus on the terrain rather than merely surviving the saddle. Raphael set a brutal pace, and she kept up, ignoring the ache building in her thighs and lower back. The homestead appeared as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, a modest cabin surrounded by carefully tended land that spoke of hard work and careful planning. Smoke rose from the chimney, and even from outside Vivian could hear the sounds of a woman in advanced labor, low moans punctuated by sharper cries that made her stomach clench with sympathetic pain. Colton met them at the door, sleeves rolled up and face drawn with the particular helplessness men felt in the face of childbirth's brutal mysteries. "She's getting weaker," he said without preamble. "I've been trying to keep her comfortable, but I don't know what else to do." Vivian pushed past him into the cabin's warmth, shedding her coat as she took in the scene. Lucia Mendoza lay on a bed near the fire, sweat-soaked and pale, her distended belly a testament to the life struggling within. She looked impossibly young, maybe 20, and terrified in a way that pierced through Vivian's own fear. "Lucia, my name is Vivian. Your brother brought me to help." She moved to the bedside, taking the girl's hand and feeling the trembling weakness there. "I need to examine you. Can you tell me when the pains come?" Lucia's eyes, dark and pain-glazed, fixed on her with desperate hope. "They don't stop anymore. Just constant. And I can feel something's wrong. The baby's not moving right." Vivian's mind raced through half-remembered conversations from her mother's work, fragments of medical knowledge she'd absorbed without fully understanding. A baby turned wrong could mean breech presentation, could mean the cord was compressed, could mean a dozen different complications that required trained hands and surgical instruments she didn't have. But dwelling on what she lacked wouldn't help. She needed to work with what she had: basic anatomy knowledge, steady hands, and the memory of her mother's calm voice talking her through an emergency delivery when Vivian was 16 and a maid had gone into precipitous labor in their Philadelphia home. "I need to check the baby's position. This will be uncomfortable." Vivian looked to Colton and Raphael, both hovering with the awkward concern of men in a woman's domain. "I'll need more hot water, and those clean linens, and both of you need to be ready to follow instructions exactly when I give them." For a moment, Colton's eyes met hers. and she saw something shift in his expression, a kind of assessment that stripped away their history and measured her purely on this moment's demands. Then he nodded once and moved toward the stove where water already steamed in a large pot. The examination confirmed Vivienne's fears. The baby was breech, buttocks presenting first, and from the feel of things, one arm was trapped awkwardly. It was the kind of presentation that killed babies and mothers both, the kind that required a physician's skill and experience Vivienne absolutely didn't possess. "Well?" Raphael's voice came tight with controlled panic. Vivienne straightened, wiping her hands on a clean cloth while her mind worked through impossibly limited options. She could try to turn the baby externally, though that risked the cord or caused other complications. She could attempt to deliver breech, guiding the baby out feet first, but the trapped arm would make that nearly impossible. Or she could do nothing and watch both Lucia and her child die over the next few hours. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "I'm going to try to turn the baby," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "It's going to hurt, Lucia, badly. But if we can get the baby positioned correctly, you'll have a chance to deliver naturally." Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her temples. "Do it, please. Save my baby." What followed was brutal and terrifying in equal measure. Vivienne pressed her hands against Lucia's abdomen, feeling for the baby's shape beneath the taut skin, and began to push with careful, steady pressure, trying to rotate the child into proper position. Lucia screamed, a sound that tore through Vivienne's composure and made Raphael look away with anguish twisting his features. But Colton moved closer, taking Lucia's hand and speaking to her in low Spanish, his voice a steady anchor of calm that Vivienne found herself unconsciously matching her movements to. She pushed and felt resistance, pushed again, and felt something shift, pushed once more, and suddenly, finally, the baby turned, slipping into position with a movement she felt more than saw. Lucia gasped, the quality of her pain changing from desperate agony to something more purposeful, more productive. "That's it," Vivienne breathed, relief making her hands shake. "The baby's head down now. You can push when the contractions tell you to." What happened next belonged to forces older than medicine, older than knowledge. Lucia's body took over with instinctive power, and Vivienne found herself guided more by intuition than training as she helped coach the laboring woman through each crushing wave of pain. Colton stayed close, his quiet presence a counterpoint to Raphael's pacing anxiety. And once, when Vivienne's confidence wavered, he caught her eye and nodded as if to say, "You can do this." The baby came in a rush of fluid and blood and squalling fury, sliding into Vivienne's waiting hands with slippery, miraculous weight. A boy, perfect and furious and alive. Vivienne's hands moved through the necessary steps, clearing his airway, cutting and tying the cord with shaking fingers, checking that he breathed properly, while her mind struggled to process what had just happened. She'd delivered a child. She'd turned a breech baby and brought it safely into the world, and both mother and son were crying now, alive and together and safe. Raphael rushed forward to see his nephew, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. Lucia reached for her baby with exhausted joy, and Vivienne placed the infant in her arms with a tenderness that felt like witnessing something sacred. Only then did she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the floor, hands still shaking, vision blurring with tears she hadn't known she was shedding. Colton appeared beside her with a cup of water, settling onto the floor with surprising grace for a man his size. He didn't speak, just sat there while she drank and tried to remember how to breathe normally. "I didn't know if I could do it," she finally whispered. "But you did. I could have killed them both. I'm not a midwife. I'm not even... You saved them both." His voice held absolute certainty. "Lucia and that baby are alive because you were here and you tried. That's what matters." Vivienne looked at him, at the weathered face and pale eyes that had shown her nothing but anger and suspicion since her arrival, and saw something different there now. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of respect that felt harder won and more valuable than any easy acceptance could have been. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for staying, for helping." Colton's jaw worked, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution for the lies she'd told or the fraud she'd committed, but it was acknowledgement, and coming from Colton Hayes, that felt like something worth holding on to. They stayed through the night, taking turns watching over Lucia and the baby while the new mother slept the sleep of utter exhaustion. Raphael refused to leave his sister's side, so Vivian and Colton ended up sharing quiet hours by the fire, speaking in low voices about everything and nothing. He told her about building Iron Creek Ranch, about the years of labor that had transformed rough land into something productive, about the loneliness that had driven him to place that advertisement, and the practical hope that maybe companionship could be built on shared purpose rather than romance. She told him about Marcus Calder, not everything, but enough. About the gambling debts that had devoured their life, about watching her husband choose a bullet over facing what he'd done, about running with nothing but fear and a desperate plan. "I'm not proud of lying to you," she said as dawn began to paint the eastern sky. "I know that doesn't fix it, but I want you to understand. I wasn't trying to trick you into caring about me. I was just trying to survive." Colton stared into the fire, silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "I know what it's like to make hard choices. This land doesn't leave room for perfect decisions." He paused. "But it does require honesty from here forward. You understand that?" "Yes." "Then maybe—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Maybe there's space for starting over, not forgetting what happened, but moving past it." Vivian's throat tightened around words she couldn't quite form. Starting over felt like more grace than she deserved, but she found herself nodding, accepting the gift of his willingness, even as she understood the conditions attached. They rode back to Iron Creek in the morning light, leaving Raphael to care for his sister and new nephew. The journey felt different now, less like a rancher grudgingly transporting a fraud, more like two people who'd survived something difficult together and emerged with fragile mutual understanding. When they reached town, Colton helped her down from Dulcie with a hand that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. "The ranch is short-handed for the winter," he said abruptly. "Raphael's going to stay with Lucia for a while, and I need someone who can handle books, manage supply orders, that sort of thing. Pays fair, room and board included." Vivian's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "You're offering me work?" "I'm offering you a job, nothing more. You'd have your own room in the main house, separate entrance, everything proper and above board." His eyes held hers, steady and serious. "But I need someone I can trust. After what you did for Lucia and those children in the storm, I figure maybe you've earned a chance to prove that trust isn't misplaced." It was the most awkward job offer in the history of frontier employment, delivered with all the romantic charm of a business transaction, and yet it felt like redemption wrapped in practical terms, like Colton Hayes' way of saying she'd proven something he hadn't expected her capable of proving. "I accept," Vivian said, fighting to keep her voice level. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Ranch work is harder than teaching school." But the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been almost a smile. "You start Monday. Bring practical clothes." "And Miss Calder?" "Yes?" "That silk dress. Burn it." This time she knew it was a smile, brief and sharp as winter sunlight. Then he was mounting his horse and riding away, leaving Vivian standing in the street with her future suddenly transformed from uncertain survival to something that looked almost like possibility. News of Lucia's successful delivery spread through Iron Creek with the same speed as any gossip, but this time the whispers carried admiration instead of suspicion. Women who'd avoided Vivian now stopped to ask questions about the birth, to share their own stories of difficult deliveries and lost babies, to express gratitude that someone with her knowledge had been there when needed. Sarah Porter pulled her aside after school. "I heard what you did. That took courage." "It took desperation," Vivian corrected. "I didn't know what I was doing half the time." "But you did it anyway. That's what courage is." Sarah squeezed her arm. "You're going to be missed at the school." The words surprised her. "I'm only taking ranch work. I can still help with the children." "Can you?" "Iron Creek Ranch is a full day's work, sometimes more." Sarah's expression held knowing sympathy. "And working that closely with Colton Hayes, that's its own kind of challenge." Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's just bookkeeping and supply management." "Of course it is." but Sarah's smile suggested she saw complications Vivian was trying hard to ignore. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Vivian purchased practical work dresses from Mrs. Henderson, who seemed almost friendly now, packed her few possessions, and tried not to think too hard about what living under Colton Hayes' roof might mean. She told herself it was employment, nothing more. A chance to prove herself useful and earn honest wages while putting distance between herself and the desperate woman who'd arrived in borrowed identity. She did not, despite Colton's suggestion, burn the emerald silk dress. Instead, she folded it carefully and placed it at the bottom of her trunk, a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled to get here. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that promised winter lurking just beyond the horizon. Raphael appeared with a wagon to transport her belongings, his face still glowing with new uncle pride. "Lucia wants you to know she's naming the baby Diego Vivian Mendoza," he said as they loaded her trunk. "After you." The information hit Vivian squarely in the chest, stealing breath and composure both. She doesn't need to do that. She wants to. You gave her back her son. That's not something a woman forgets. Raphael settled into the driver's seat, studying her with frank assessment. "Colton told me about the job offer. You know what you're getting into?" "Bookkeeping and supplies. He was very clear. I meant working for a man who doesn't trust easy and won't tolerate being lied to twice." Raphael's voice held no judgment, just honest warning. "He's giving you a chance, Miss Calder. Don't waste it." "I don't plan to." The ride to Iron Creek Ranch took them through country that looked different in daylight, rolling grassland giving way to higher elevations where pine forests climbed toward mountain peaks already dusted with snow. Cattle bearing the ranch's brand dotted the landscape, and Vivian found herself impressed despite her ignorance of ranching. This was real wealth, the kind built from sweat and skill, rather than gambling tables and social connections. The ranch house rose against the mountains like it had grown there naturally, timber and stone constructed to withstand whatever the frontier threw at it. The wide porch Colton had mentioned wrapped around the front, and Vivian could imagine watching sunsets from there, coffee in hand, the vast Montana sky spreading out like a promise. Colton met them in the yard, and the sight of him in working clothes, denim and worn cotton instead of town dress, did something complicated to Vivian's pulse that she firmly ignored. This was her employer, nothing more. The fact that he'd saved children and steadied her through a difficult delivery and offered her unexpected grace didn't change the fundamental reality that he'd made his feelings about her abundantly clear. "Your room's upstairs, Eastside," he said without preamble. "Raphael will show you. Dinner's at 6. We start early, so breakfast is 5:30. Office is downstairs, and I'll show you the books after you're settled." It was pure business, exactly what they'd agreed to. So why did it feel vaguely disappointing? The room he'd given her was larger than she expected, with a window overlooking the eastern pastures and simple furniture that spoke of function over decoration. A bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a small desk, and a washstand. The separate entrance he'd mentioned led to external stairs, ensuring she could come and go without passing through the main house, propriety maintained even in wilderness. Vivian unpacked slowly, placing her few possessions around the room and trying to imagine living here through the winter. Trying to imagine working alongside Colton Hayes day after day, rebuilding trust from the ashes of her lies, proving herself worthy of the chance he'd offered. The office proved to be organized chaos, ledgers stacked haphazardly, receipts stuffed in drawers, supply lists scrawled on whatever paper came to hand. Colton stood amid the disaster, looking vaguely embarrassed. "I'm better with cattle than paperwork," he admitted. Vivian surveyed the mess with growing determination. "I can see that. Raphael usually helps, but he's got his hands full with Lucia and the baby, and before that, well, we managed." He pulled out a chair for her, the gesture automatic and oddly courtly. "Current accounts are here, previous years are there, supply orders go through Henderson's store, but we deal with buyers from 3 different territories, and tracking it all gets complicated. I understand." Vivian sat, already mentally organizing the chaos into systems. "Give me a week. I'll have it sorted." Something shifted in Colton's expression. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. "You sound confident." "I kept my husband's accounts for 5 years. He gambled away everything we had, but the ledgers were always perfect." The bitterness in her voice surprised her, and she tried to soften it. "I'm good with numbers, that's something." Colton studied her for a long moment, and Vivian felt the weight of that pale gaze like physical pressure. Then he nodded once and headed toward the door. Vivian. She looked up at the sound of her given name, the first time he'd used it without the formal Miss Calder distance. You do good work here. Prove yourself reliable. And what happened before? It stays before. We move forward. Agreed? The offer felt like covenant, binding and serious in a way that made her throat tight. Agreed. Good. He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. Welcome to Iron Creek Ranch. Then he was gone, leaving Vivian alone with ledgers and receipts and the strangest feeling that she'd just been given something infinitely more valuable than employment. Like she'd been handed the raw materials for building a completely new life, and all she had to do was prove herself worthy of the opportunity. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The ledgers told stories Colton Hayes had never bothered to read. Vivian spent the first 3 days buried in numbers that revealed a ranch running on instinct rather than strategy, profitable more through stubborn determination than actual planning. Feed costs fluctuated wildly because orders were placed reactively instead of seasonally. Cattle sales happened when buyers appeared rather than when market prices peaked. Supply purchases showed no bulk negotiation, no long-term contracts, nothing that suggested anyone had ever sat down and actually calculated optimal timing. It was simultaneously impressive and infuriating. Colton had built something substantial while ignoring half the tools that could make it even better. By Thursday morning, Vivian had reorganized 3 years of accounts, cross-referenced supply orders with seasonal pricing, and drafted a preliminary budget that would save the ranch nearly 15% on operating costs without cutting a single necessary expense. She presented her findings over breakfast, spreading papers across the kitchen table, while Colton ate scrambled eggs and regarded her work with the suspicious interest of a man being told his instincts were wrong. "You're saying I've been overpaying for feed," he said, voice flat. "I'm saying you've been paying market rate when you could negotiate bulk contracts at harvest time for significant savings." Vivian tapped the relevant column. "Henderson orders from the same supplier. If you coordinated purchases, you'd both benefit from volume pricing. Henderson and I don't coordinate much of anything." "Then start. Unless you prefer spending extra money out of stubbornness." The words came out sharper than intended, and Vivian braced for anger. Instead, Colton's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "You always this direct?" "Only when I'm right." She met his eyes, refusing to back down. "These numbers don't lie, Colton. You've built something remarkable here, but you're bleeding money in places you don't need to." He studied the figures for a long moment, and Vivian watched thoughts move behind those pale eyes, pride wrestling with pragmatism, the rancher's instinct for independence fighting against undeniable mathematical reality. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right. Set up a meeting with Henderson. Let's see if the old bastard is willing to negotiate." The victory felt sweeter than it should have, and Vivian allowed herself a small smile before gathering the papers. "I'll ride into town this afternoon. Take Dulcie. She knows the route." Colton stood, carrying his plate to the sink with an efficiency that spoke of years living without household help. "And Vivian? Good work. This is—" He gestured at the ledgers, seeming to search for words. "This is what I needed. What the ranch needed." The praise landed warm in her chest, and she found herself fighting the urge to deflect or diminish it. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you," and meant it more than he could possibly know. The ride to Iron Creek gave Vivian time to think, to process how dramatically her life had shifted in just weeks. The woman who'd arrived in silk and terror felt like someone from another lifetime. That Vivian had been running from debts and dangerous men, carrying nothing but lies and desperate hope. This Vivian rode a steady horse through Montana autumn, carrying ledgers and legitimate purpose, working for a man who'd given her a chance to prove herself something better than her worst decisions. The transformation should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt fragile, like something that could shatter if she examined it too closely, or forgot for even a moment how easily it could all be taken away. Henderson proved surprisingly amenable to bulk purchasing negotiations, especially when Vivian laid out numbers showing mutual benefit. They arranged a meeting for the following week with the feed supplier, and Vivian left the general store feeling the peculiar satisfaction of a job well done. She was heading toward Dulcie when a voice stopped her cold. Vivian Calder, or should I say Margaret Thornton. The man standing beside the bank wore a suit too fine for Iron Creek and a smile too sharp for anything but trouble. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of polished appearance that came from city money and the predatory stillness of someone who enjoyed watching people squirm. Vivian's heart kicked into her throat as recognition slammed through her. Thomas Blackwell, one of Marcus's creditors, one of the men who'd climbed that St. Louis fire escape. "I don't know you," she said, voice steady despite the terror clawing up her spine. "No?" Blackwell's smile widened. "Funny, because I know you very well, Mrs. Calder. Your late husband owed my associates a considerable sum before his unfortunate demise, $23,000 to be precise." The number hit like a fist. She'd known Marcus's debts were substantial, but $23,000 was generational wealth, the kind of money that could buy ranches or destroy lives with equal ease. "I don't have that kind of money." "Obviously. If you did, you wouldn't be hiding in this godforsaken frontier town pretending to be a rancher's bookkeeper." Blackwell stepped closer, and Vivian fought every instinct that screamed at her to run. "But here's the interesting thing about debt, Mrs. Calder. It doesn't disappear just because you run from it, and my associates have been very patient while I tracked you down. My husband's debts died with him. Not quite how that works, I'm afraid. Marital debt transfers. Legally speaking, you're responsible for every dollar Marcus borrowed." He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, offered it with theatrical courtesy. "This is a promissory note bearing your signature, co-signing one of his larger loans. Perfectly legitimate, perfectly enforceable." Vivian took the paper with shaking hands and stared at her own signature, remembering the night Marcus had begged her to sign, promising it was just a formality, just insurance the lender required. She'd been so naive then, so willing to believe his reassurances. "I can't pay this." "Then we'll have to explore alternative arrangements." Blackwell's voice dropped to something uglier. "You're living at Iron Creek Ranch now, working for Colton Hayes, a man of some substance. I imagine he wouldn't appreciate learning about your criminal past." The threat was clear as Montana sky, and Vivian felt the world tilt sideways. Everything she'd built, the trust, the job, the fragile new life, balanced on a knife's edge, and Blackwell held the handle. "What do you want?" "For now, just to remind you I'm here, that I'm watching, that debts come due eventually, one way or another." He tipped his hat with mock politeness. "We'll talk again soon, Mrs. Calder. Until then, do try to enjoy your little frontier adventure." He walked away, leaving Vivian standing frozen in the street, the promissory note crumpling in her white-knuckled grip. Around her, Iron Creek continued its afternoon business, oblivious to the fact that her entire world had just collapsed again. The ride back to the ranch passed in numb horror. Vivian's mind raced through impossible options, each one worse than the last. She could run again, but Blackwell had proven he could find her anywhere. She could tell Colton, but why would he believe her? Why would he risk his ranch protecting a woman who'd already lied to him once? She could try to negotiate with Blackwell, but she had nothing to negotiate with except her own destruction. By the time she reached Iron Creek Ranch, panic had crystallized into something colder and more dangerous. She'd survived Marcus's death. She'd survived the flight from St. Louis. She'd survived a blizzard and a breech birth, and Colton Hayes' initial fury. She'd be damned if she let Thomas Blackwell destroy what she'd fought so hard to build. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was facing. That night, after dinner, when Colton had retreated to his study to review breeding records, Vivian sat in her room and forced herself to read the promissory note with clear eyes. The terms were exactly as Blackwell described. Her signature bound her to $23,000 plus accumulating interest, now totaling nearly $30,000. The date was 3 years old, back when she'd still believed Marcus could turn things around, still thought love meant blind trust instead of painful wisdom. The amount was impossible. Even if she worked for Colton for 20 years and saved every penny, she'd never earn enough to pay it, which meant Blackwell wasn't interested in money. He was interested in leverage, in whatever scheme he was building that required Vivian as a pawn. The realization should have brought clarity. Instead, it brought exhaustion so profound she could barely hold her head up. She'd been so close to something real, something honest, and now it was slipping away like water through desperate fingers. A knock at her door made her jump. She opened it to find Colton standing there, face creased with concern that looked foreign on his usually stern features. "You all right? You barely touched dinner." "I'm fine. Just tired." The lie tasted like ash, but telling him the truth felt like leaping off a cliff with no certainty of landing. He studied her with those pale eyes that seemed to see through every wall she built. "You're a terrible liar. Has anyone ever told you that?" Despite everything, Vivian felt her mouth quirk in something like a smile. "You did. Several times." "So I did." Colton leaned against the doorframe, making no move to come in, but also no move to leave. "Something happened in town. Want to tell me what?" The concern in his voice nearly broke her. It would be so easy to tell him everything, to lay the whole ugly truth at his feet, and trust that the man who'd called her brave might also call her worth protecting. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when Blackwell was watching, not when one wrong word could destroy everything. "Just ghosts," she said quietly. "Sometimes the past catches up faster than expected." Colton's jaw tightened, and she watched him wrestle with pushing for more versus respecting her privacy. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Those ghosts come around causing real problems. You tell me. Understand?" "I understand." "I mean it, Vivian. You're part of this ranch now. That means you're not facing trouble alone." The words nearly destroyed her careful composure, and Vivian had to look away before the tears threatening to spill actually did. "Thank you. That means more than you know." He left her then, but the warmth of his concern lingered like a promise she desperately wanted to believe in. She sat in the dark for a long time, holding the promissory note and trying to find a path forward that didn't end in losing everything again. Sleep, when it finally came, brought nightmares of fire escapes and climbing men and debts that swallowed whole lives without mercy. The next 2 weeks passed in tense normalcy. Vivian managed the ranch accounts with focused determination, finding efficiency in every corner, saving money that Colton acknowledged with gruff approval. The meeting with the feed supplier went better than expected, resulting in a contract that would save both the ranch and Henderson's store significant funds. Small victories that should have felt triumphant, but instead felt like building sandcastles against an incoming tide. Blackwell appeared twice more, once watching from across the street when Vivian went to town for supplies, once riding past the ranch at dusk, making sure she saw him. Each sighting was a reminder, a threat wrapped in silent observation. He was waiting for something, building towards some move Vivian couldn't predict and couldn't prevent. The stress manifested in ways she couldn't quite hide. She ate less, slept worse, jumped at unexpected sounds. Colton noticed. How could he not? But respected her earlier deflection enough not to push. Instead, he found small ways to show concern, leaving coffee already brewed in the morning, assigning her easier tasks when exhaustion showed in her face, sitting quietly on the porch some evenings when words felt impossible but presence helped anyway. The kindness made everything harder, made the lies feel heavier, made the inevitable revelation more terrifying. It was Raphael who finally forced the confrontation. He appeared one afternoon while Vivian was working on supply orders, closing the office door with deliberate care that immediately set her nerves on edge. "There's a man asking questions about you in town," he said without preamble. "Fancy suit, city accent. Told Mrs. Henderson he's a business associate of your late husband's." Vivian's hand stilled on the ledger. "What kind of questions? How long you've been here? Where you're living? If Colton pays you regular wages?" Raphael's expression held no judgment, just steady concern. "He offered me $50 to share details about the ranch's finances." "Did you take it?" "What do you think?" His voice sharpened. "I told him to get the hell out of Iron Creek before I introduced him to Frontier Hospitality. But Vivian, whatever trouble you're running from, it's here now, and Colton deserves to know before it lands on his doorstep." The words hit like physical blows because they were absolutely right. She'd been selfish, cowardly, protecting herself while putting Colton and the ranch at risk. The realization burned through her chest like acid. "You're right," she said quietly. "I'll tell him tonight." "You want me there?" No, this is something I need to do myself. Raphael nodded, squeezed her shoulder with rough affection, and left her alone with the weight of impending confession. That evening, Vivian found Colton in the barn, checking on a mare who'd gone lame. He worked with patient skill, examining the horse's leg with gentle hands that contrasted sharply with his harsh exterior. She watched him for a moment, gathering courage, then spoke before fear could steal her voice. I need to tell you something, and you're going to be angry. Colton looked up, registered the seriousness in her expression, and carefully set down the mare's hoof. All right. Can we somewhere private? They walked to his study in silence, heavy with unspoken dread. Colton settled behind his desk while Vivian remained standing, too agitated to sit. The promissory note felt like lead in her pocket. There's a man in town, Thomas Blackwell. He's one of my dead husband's creditors. The words came out steady despite her racing heart. Marcus died owing him $23,000, and I co-signed the debt without fully understanding what that meant. Now Blackwell's come to collect, and he's threatening to use me against you somehow. Against the ranch. Colton's face went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded storms. How long has he been here? 2 weeks. He approached me the day I went to negotiate with Henderson. 2 weeks. Colton's voice dropped dangerously low. You've known about this threat for 2 weeks and said nothing. I was trying to figure out how to handle it without telling me? He stood abruptly, the movement sharp with controlled fury. Without trusting me enough to help? After everything He stopped, jaw clenching hard. I told you, ghosts that cause real problems, you come to me. And you looked me in the eye and lied. I didn't lie. I just withheld truth. Same damn thing, Vivian. Colton turned away, staring out the window at darkening sky. I gave you a chance here. A real chance. Put my trust in you despite every reason not to. And the first time trouble shows up, you hide it. The accusation landed with devastating accuracy because it was absolutely true. She'd protected herself at his expense, repeated the exact pattern that had brought her here in the first place, choosing deception over difficult honesty. You're right, she said quietly. I should have told you immediately. I was scared and I was selfish and I made the wrong choice. Again. What does Blackwell want? I don't know yet. He hasn't made specific demands, just threats. Reminders that he's watching. $23,000. Colton said it like testing the weight of the words. That's what your silence was worth? No, nothing's worth that. Vivian pulled out the promissory note with shaking hands and set it on his desk. I signed this 3 years ago believing it was a formality. My husband lied about that like he lied about everything else. When he couldn't pay, he killed himself rather than face consequences. And I ran because the alternative was... She stopped, unwilling to voice the ugliness Blackwell's associates had threatened. Colton picked up the document, read it with grim focus, then set it down with careful precision. This is legally binding. A good lawyer might fight it, but out here, I know. I'm trapped. We're trapped. The moment Blackwell connected you to this ranch, he made it my problem too. There was no accusation in the words now, just flat acknowledgement of reality. What's his play? I think he wants leverage over the ranch somehow. He asked Raphael about finances, about your assets, like he's looking for pressure points. Colton's expression darkened. He won't find any. This ranch is paid clear, no debts, no mortgages. Everything I have is earned and owned outright. Then maybe he wants to change that, force you into debt protecting me, or force me to give you up to protect the ranch. Colton met her eyes, and Vivian saw the cold calculation there. The rancher weighing costs and benefits, measuring what he could afford to lose. That would be the smart play. The words shouldn't have hurt. This was business, practical frontier pragmatism. But they hurt anyway, sharp and deep. I'll leave, Vivian said, voice steadier than she felt. Tonight. Disappear before Blackwell can use me against you. And go where? He found you here. He'll find you anywhere. Colton moved to the window, staring out at land he'd bled to build. No, running's what got you into this mess. Time to stand and fight. Fight with what? I have no money, no legal standing, nothing. You have me." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Vivian stared at his back, trying to process what he'd just offered. "Why would you, after everything I've done, all the lies, because you earned a place here?" Colton turned, and his expression held something fierce and uncompromising. "You rode into a blizzard for children you barely knew. You turned a breech baby and saved 2 lives. You've worked harder than anyone I've hired, and you've been honest about everything since I gave you that chance." He paused. "One mistake, keeping this from me, doesn't erase all that. Doesn't mean I'm throwing you to wolves." Vivian felt tears burn hot behind her eyes and fought desperately to hold them back. "I don't deserve your protection." "Maybe not, but you're getting it anyway." Colton's voice gentled slightly. "We'll face Blackwell together. Find out what he really wants, what leverage we have. But Vivian, no more secrets. No more protecting me by hiding truth. We do this as partners or not at all." The word partners hit her chest like a blow and a benediction both. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Now tell me everything about Marcus's debts. Every detail, no matter how ugly." They talked until past midnight, Vivian laying out the full extent of Marcus's gambling, the creditors who'd circled like vultures, the threats that had driven her west. Colton listened with focused intensity, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed a mind built for strategy. By the time they finished, he'd filled 3 pages with notes, and Vivian felt simultaneously exposed and relieved, like lancing a wound that had festered too long. "Blackwell will make his move soon," Colton said finally. "Men like him don't wait forever. When he does, we'll be ready." "What if we're not? What if—" "Then we deal with it together. That's what partners do." The word again, deliberate and steadying. Vivian nodded and stood to leave, exhaustion pulling at her bones. At the door, Colton's voice stopped her. "Vivian, thank you for finally trusting me." She looked back at him, at the weathered face and pale eyes that held more kindness than she deserved. "Thank you for still being worth trusting." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. Then he nodded once, and she left him alone with his notes and the weight of trouble she'd brought to his door. Sleep came easier that night despite the looming threat, and Vivian woke to pale dawn light feeling steadier than she had in weeks. The truth was out. The worst had been said. And somehow, impossibly, she hadn't been cast out. Colton Hayes had chosen to fight beside her instead of cutting her loose, and that meant something. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Blackwell made his move 3 days later, appearing at the ranch in mid-morning with 2 rough men flanking him like threats made flesh. Vivian saw them from the office window and felt ice flood her veins. But Colton was already moving toward the door, and when she started to follow, he shook his head. "Stay inside. Let me handle this." "He's here because of me." "Exactly why you stay inside." His voice left no room for argument. "Trust me." She watched through the window as Colton met Blackwell in the yard, saw the city man's smile and Colton's stone-faced response. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes, too far away for Vivian to hear, close enough to see Blackwell's expression shift from confident to uncertain to something like anger. Then Colton turned and walked back to the house without looking back, leaving Blackwell standing in the yard like a man who'd just lost a hand he'd been certain he'd win. "What did you tell him?" Vivian asked as Colton entered. "That his debt is with you, not me. That you work here under legal employment contract, and any attempt to interfere with that constitutes harassment. That Iron Creek Ranch has excellent relationships with the territorial marshal, and I'd be happy to pursue charges for attempted extortion." Colton's mouth quirked grimly. "Also that if he sets foot on my property again without invitation, I'll consider it trespassing and respond accordingly." "He won't just leave." "No, but he'll think twice about direct confrontation. Men like Blackwell prefer easy prey. We just made you significantly less easy." Through the window, Vivian watched Blackwell and his men ride away, and for the first time since that St. Louis hotel room, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing this alone anymore. Blackwell's retreat bought them time, but not peace. Over the following weeks, Vivian caught glimpses of him in Iron Creek, always watching, always waiting, a predator circling wounded prey with patient malice. He made no direct moves, filed no legal claims, simply existed as a constant reminder that her past hadn't finished with her yet. Colton responded by making Vivian's position at the ranch unassailable. He filed formal employment contracts with the territorial office, established her as essential ranch personnel with legal standing, and made certain everyone in Iron Creek knew she worked under his protection. It was strategic and coldly practical, the kind of defensive maneuvering that came from understanding frontier law's peculiar gaps and how to exploit them. But there were moments, small, unguarded moments, when Vivian caught something else in his actions. The way he'd ride out to check fences near where she was working, ostensibly to inspect his own property, but somehow always appearing when she needed help lifting heavy ledgers or reaching high shelves. The way he'd leave her favorite coffee blend on the kitchen counter without comment. The way his eyes would track her movements across the yard with an intensity that had nothing to do with employee supervision. She told herself she was imagining it. Told herself Colton Hayes was simply a man who protected what belonged to him, and she belonged to Iron Creek Ranch now through legal employment and shared struggle. Nothing more. But her heart, traitorous and foolish, whispered different stories late at night when she couldn't sleep. November arrived with the kind of cold that warned of brutal winter ahead. The first serious snow came on a Tuesday, blanketing the valley in white silence and transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and dangerous. Vivian stood on the porch watching it fall, wrapped in a wool shawl Colton had wordlessly left on her door the previous evening, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt genuinely safe. The answer unsettled her. Not in years. Not since before Marcus, before the debts and lies and desperate running. Maybe never if she was honest. Safety had always felt conditional, something granted by circumstance or other people's goodwill, never something she could build for herself. Until now, until a Montana ranch and a stern rancher who'd offered partnership when she deserved nothing but judgment. "Gonna freeze standing out here," Colton's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him carrying 2 steaming mugs. He handed her one, coffee doctored exactly how she preferred it, which meant he'd been paying attention in ways that made her chest tight. "I like watching it fall. It's peaceful. Peaceful now. Wait until we're digging cattle out of drifts come January." But his voice held no real complaint, and he settled against the porch railing beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth through the cold air. "Raphael sent word. Lucia and the baby are doing well. She wants you to visit when weather permits." "I'd like that." Vivian sipped her coffee, using the heat to warm hands gone numb. How does she manage? Out there alone with a newborn while Raphael's here working? Her mother came from New Mexico, and neighbors help. That's how it works out here. You take care of your own. Colton studied the falling snow with eyes that seemed to see past the beauty to the challenges it represented. "Speaking of which, I'm moving the herd to lower pasture tomorrow. Could use your help with inventory counts before they go." It was make work. They both knew it. The herd numbers were already documented in ledgers Vivian had meticulously organized. But it was also Colton's way of keeping her close, keeping her busy, keeping her from dwelling too long on Blackwell's continued presence in town. "Of course. What time?" "Dawn. Dress warm. It'll be brutal out there." They stood in comfortable silence, watching snow erase the world in white. Vivian felt something shift in the air between them, some invisible barrier wearing thin through proximity and shared crisis. She should step away, retreat to the safety of professional distance. Instead, she heard herself ask the question that had haunted her since that night in his study. "Why are you really doing this? Protecting me, fighting for me? I brought nothing but trouble to your door." Colton was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice came rough with something that sounded dangerously like honesty. "You want the truth?" "Always. At first it was principle. You'd earned a place here through honest work. And I don't abandon people who've proven themselves." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But somewhere along the way it stopped being about principle and started being about—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "Started being about not wanting to lose you." The admission hung in the frozen air between them, raw and undefended. Vivian's heart kicked hard against her ribs, and she found herself unable to look at him, unable to process what he'd just confessed. "Colton, I know, it's complicated. You work for me, you're dealing with Blackwell, and I swore this was just employment." He finally turned to face her, and the expression in his pale eyes stole her breath. "But I'm done pretending I don't care what happens to you. Done acting like you're just another ranch hand I'm protecting out of obligation. Then what am I?" "I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with calloused gentleness. "If you're willing." Vivian's breath caught. Every rational part of her brain screamed warnings. This was her employer. This was complicated. This was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Blackwell and everything to do with her own battered heart. But her heart, foolish thing, recognized something in Colton Hayes that it had never found before. Not passion or romance or pretty words, but something harder and more real. Partnership. Respect. The willingness to stand beside her when standing alone would have been easier. "I'm willing," she whispered. "But Colton, I need you to understand. I'm damaged, broken in ways I don't know how to fix. And with Blackwell still circling, you think I'm not damaged? I'm 42 years old, Vivian. Built this ranch with my own hands because I couldn't work with anyone else, couldn't trust anyone enough to let them close." His thumb traced her cheekbone with devastating tenderness. "Maybe we're both broken. Maybe that's exactly why this might work." She should argue, should point out all the logical reasons this was impossible. Instead, she leaned into his touch and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stop running, stop hiding, and build something real with a man who'd already seen her at her worst and chosen her anyway. The moment shattered when Raphael appeared around the corner of the house, stopping short at the sight of them. His weathered face split into a knowing grin. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a problem. 3 head missing from the north pasture, and there's tracks heading toward the ridge." Colton dropped his hand, but not before squeezing Vivian's shoulder once in silent promise. "Wolves or thieves?" "Can't tell yet, but in this snow, they won't get far either way." "Saddle horses. I'll grab rifles." Colton was already moving, all business now, the rancher displacing the man who'd just confessed feelings he'd sworn to keep buried. At the door, he looked back at Vivian. "Stay inside, lock the doors. If anyone but me or Raphael comes around—" "I know. I'll be careful." She watched them ride out into the snowstorm, 3 dark shapes disappearing into white, and tried not to think about all the ways Montana could kill careless men. Tried not to acknowledge how much Colton's safety suddenly mattered, how the thought of losing him created a hollow ache in her chest that felt dangerously like something more than professional concern. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Vivian tried to work on ledgers but found herself constantly checking the window, watching for riders who didn't appear. By the time darkness fell and they still hadn't returned, fear had crystallized into something sharp and cold. She was considering violating Colton's orders and riding out to search when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Relief flooded through her until she saw who was dismounting. Not Colton and Raphael. Thomas Blackwell, alone, wearing an expression that made Vivian's blood run cold. She met him at the door with a rifle she barely knew how to use but held with enough conviction that Blackwell stopped at the porch steps. "That's unnecessary, Mrs. Calder. I'm here to talk, nothing more." "Talk from there." Blackwell's smile held no warmth. "Your rancher friend isn't here to protect you. My men made sure of that. 3 cattle released from the north pasture, tracks leading to the ridge. They'll be gone for hours chasing shadows." The admission confirmed Vivian's worst fears. "You're threatening the wrong person. Colton won't negotiate over me." "Won't he? I think he will, especially when I explain the alternative." Blackwell pulled a document from his coat, held it up so she could see official seals and legal language. "I've filed a claim with the territorial court. $23,000 plus interest secured against your future earnings and assets, which means anything you make working here goes directly to paying your debt. I'll never earn that much." "Exactly. Which means you'll work for Hayes for free, forever, trapped in indentured servitude. Unless—" Blackwell's smile widened. "He pays the debt himself to free you. $30,000. A substantial sum, but not impossible for a man with a profitable ranch. The trap snapped shut with brutal clarity. Either Vivian worked without wages, making her worthless to Colton and the ranch, or Colton paid a fortune to free her from debt she'd brought on herself. Either way, Blackwell won. Either way, she lost. He'll never pay it. Then you'll work for nothing until you die. Or Blackwell descended one step closer, and Vivian raised the rifle higher. Or you come with me now, work off your debt in more profitable ways, and spare Hayes the burden of your presence. The implication made her stomach turn. I'd rather die. That can be arranged too. But think carefully, Mrs. Calder. Is your pride worth destroying the man who's protected you? Because that's what you're doing. Every day you stay here, you're bleeding him dry. Better to leave now before you ruin him completely. The words hit their target with surgical precision because they echoed every fear Vivian had carried since arriving in Montana. That she was poison, that she destroyed everything she touched, that the best thing she could do for people she cared about was disappear. But then she remembered Colton's words on the porch, not wanting to lose you, the quiet strength of his partnership, the way he'd called her brave even when she felt like nothing but a coward. Get off this property, she said, voice shaking but determined. Now, before I shoot you for trespassing. You won't shoot me. You're not a killer, Mrs. Calder, just a frightened woman playing at being something she's not. But Blackwell stepped backward anyway, reading enough truth in her expression to make him cautious. You have until tomorrow to decide. Leave with me, or watch Hayes destroy himself trying to save you. He mounted and rode into the darkness, leaving Vivian trembling on the porch with a rifle she'd never have actually fired and a choice that felt impossible. She was still standing there when Colton and Raphael finally returned, frost-covered and furious, having found nothing but deliberately laid false trails. Bastard set us up, Colton was saying as he dismounted. Then he saw Vivian's face and went very still. What happened? She told him everything, Blackwell's visit, the legal claim, the impossible choice, watched his expression darken with each word until fury radiated from him like heat. He wants $30,000 to release the debt claim. That's extortion. That's legal extortion. He filed with the territorial court, Colton. It's enforceable. Vivian set down the rifle before her shaking hands betrayed her. And he's right. I can't work here without wages. I'm a burden now, not an asset. The smart thing would be to let me go. The smart thing, Colton's voice came out dangerously low, would be for Blackwell to get on a train back east before I forget I'm a civilized man. You can't fight this. He has the law on his side. Then we find a way around the law. Colton took her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me. You are not leaving. You are not going with him. We'll figure this out, but you stay here. Understand? It's $30,000, Colton. I know what it is. I also know what you're worth. The words hit her chest like a blow. And it's more than money. Vivian felt tears burn hot behind her eyes and fought desperately to hold them back. I can't let you destroy yourself for me. You don't get to decide that. This is my choice, my ranch, my... He stopped, jaw working. My life to spend how I see fit, and I'm choosing to fight for you. The declaration should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt terrifying, like watching someone she cared about walk willingly into fire. But before she could argue further, Raphael cleared his throat. Maybe there's another way. My cousin Diego, he's a lawyer in Helena, handles territorial disputes. If anyone can find holes in Blackwell's claim, it's him. Colton turned, hope flickering across his features. Can you contact him? I'll ride out at first light. But boss, even if Diego finds something, legal fights take time, and Blackwell gave Vivian until tomorrow. Then we stall him. Tell him we need time to consider, to arrange funds, whatever buys us space. Colton's hand found Vivian's, squeezed hard. We're not giving up. Not now. That night, Vivian lay awake, listening to the house settle around her and wondering how her life had become this strange, impossible thing. 6 months ago, she'd been running from debts and borrowed identity, certain she'd never find safety anywhere. Now she was fighting to stay somewhere she'd never meant to land, protecting a life she'd built from lies and desperation and the unexpected grace of a man who'd called her brave. Tomorrow, Blackwell would return for his answer. Tomorrow, she'd have to choose between destroying herself or destroying Colton. Tomorrow, everything she'd fought to build might crumble anyway. But tonight she let herself believe that maybe, somehow, there was still a path forward. That maybe the woman who'd survived blizzards and breech births and her own worst mistakes could survive this too. She fell asleep holding that hope like a candle against the dark, fragile, but burning still. Morning arrived with brutal clarity and the knowledge that hope alone wouldn't stop Blackwell. Raphael left before dawn on the long ride to Helena, carrying a letter outlining Vivian's situation and a desperate plea for legal assistance that might arrive too late to matter. Colton spent the early hours in his study, reviewing finances with grim focus, calculating what $30,000 would actually cost him. Vivian found him there as pale sunlight began painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and white. "How bad is it?" she asked from the doorway. "Bad. Not impossible, but it would take every dollar of reserve capital, money set aside for expanding the herd, weathering bad seasons, everything I've saved for 15 years. He didn't look up from the ledgers. "I'd survive, the ranch would survive. But there'd be no margin for error, no cushion if something went wrong. Then you can't do it. It's too much risk." "That's not your decision to make." "Colton, please, be practical. I'm one person, one employee." "You're not just an employee." He finally looked up, and the intensity in his pale eyes made her breath catch. "And you know it." The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Somewhere in the chaos of blizzards and shared crisis and quiet mornings on the porch, they'd become something more than employer and worker, something that made $30,000 feel less like extortion and more like the price of keeping someone who mattered. But before Vivian could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard announced Blackwell's arrival. Right on schedule, exactly as promised, coming to collect his answer. Colton stood, jaw set with determination. "Stay inside. Let me handle this." "No, this is my debt, my choice. I need to face him." They walked out together into cold morning air, presenting a united front that made Blackwell's confident smile falter slightly. He sat astride a fine horse, flanked again by his two rough companions, looking every inch the predator certain of victory. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Calder, I trust you've reached a decision." "We need more time," Colton said flatly. $30,000 isn't pocket change. Gathering that much requires liquidating assets, arranging transfers. You have until sunset, any longer, and I file additional claims for delayed payment penalties. Blackwell's voice held smug satisfaction. "Tick-tock, Mr. Hayes, the clock is running." "What guarantee do we have that paying releases the claim entirely? That you won't come back demanding more?" "My word as a gentleman." "Your word is worth shit." Colton's voice dropped to something dangerous. "We want legal documentation, official release signed by a territorial judge, not some paper you draft yourself." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Blackwell's features. Legal documentation meant witnesses, meant permanent records that couldn't be conveniently altered. It meant legitimacy he clearly hadn't expected to provide. "That's unnecessary. The debt settlement is straightforward. Then proving it in court should be no trouble." Colton stepped forward, and despite being outnumbered, he projected such raw authority that Blackwell's horse actually shifted backward. "You want $30,000? Fine. But we do this legally, with proper documentation, or we do it in front of a territorial judge who might want to know why a St. Louis creditor is filing claims 3 years after the original debtor's death." Blackwell's face darkened with anger. "You're stalling." "I'm ensuring fair dealing, something you clearly have no experience with." The two men faced each other across the frozen yard, and Vivian held her breath, watching Blackwell calculate his options. He could push, could threaten, but Colton had just exposed the weakness in his entire scheme. It relied on intimidation and quick capitulation, not actual legal scrutiny. "Sunset," Blackwell finally said, voice tight with barely controlled fury. $30,000, proper documentation, or I pursue every legal avenue available. And Mr. Hayes, you'll lose more than money before I'm finished." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, his men following, leaving Colton and Vivian standing in the churned-up snow. "That bought us maybe 6 hours," Colton said quietly. Raphael better ride fast. They spent the morning in tense preparation, gathering every document related to Vivian's debt, drafting their own legal arguments, preparing for a fight neither of them was certain they could win. Colton worked with focused intensity, but Vivian caught him watching her occasionally, something fierce and protective in his gaze that made her heart ache. Around noon, she found him in the barn checking weapons, rifles, pistols, knives laid out with the careful attention of a man preparing for violence. "You think it'll come to that?" "I think Blackwell didn't expect resistance, and desperate men do stupid things." Colton loaded shells into a rifle with practiced efficiency. "I won't let him take you, Vivian. Not without a fight." The declaration should have frightened her. Instead, it settled something deep in her chest, some fundamental truth she'd been avoiding since that first night in the storm. She cared about Colton Hayes, cared enough that the thought of him bleeding for her debts was unbearable, cared enough that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to fight just as hard to stay. "There might be another option," she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "Something Blackwell won't expect." "What?" Vivian took a breath, steadying herself. "Marry me." The words fell into shocked silence. Colton's hand stilled on the rifle, and he turned to face her with an expression of pure disbelief. "What?" "Marry me. Today. Right now." The plan crystallized with desperate clarity. "If we're legally married, my debts become marital debts, which means they're as much your responsibility as mine. Blackwell can't claim against just me anymore. He'd have to claim against both of us, against the ranch itself. And that requires entirely different legal proceedings, ones that take months and require proof of joint liability. That's..." Colton seemed genuinely speechless, and Vivian pressed forward before courage failed. "It buys us time. Time for Raphael's cousin to find legal holes, time to build a real defense. And it's not... I'm not asking you to actually..." She faltered, heat flooding her face. "It would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. Protection for both of us." Colton stared at her for a long moment, and Vivian braced for rejection, for anger at the audacity of suggesting marriage as legal strategy. Instead, his mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "Vivian Calder, that's either the smartest or stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Which do you think it is?" He set down the rifle and crossed to where she stood, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his pale eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I think it's desperate and brilliant and completely insane. I also think..." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "I think I was going to ask you myself eventually, just maybe not under these circumstances." Vivian's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "You were?" "I told you, I don't want to lose you, and I meant it." His hand came up to cup her face with devastating gentleness. "So yes, I'll marry you, for legal protection, for buying time, for whatever reason gets us through this." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "But Vivian, understand something. I'm not the kind of man who does things halfway. You agree to this. We're partners. Real partners. In everything." The intensity in his voice, in his eyes, left no room for misunderstanding. He was offering partnership, but also something more, something that felt terrifyingly close to love. "I understand," she whispered. "Then let's go find Reverend Michaels before I change my mind about being civilized." They rode to Iron Creek together through snow-bright afternoon, and if anyone thought it strange that the rancher and his bookkeeper were seeking the Reverend with such urgency, they kept it to themselves. Reverend Michaels, for his part, took one look at their determined faces and asked no questions beyond the legally required ones. The ceremony took place in his small study with only his wife as witness, simple words spoken over clasped hands. Vivian heard herself promise partnership and honesty, heard Colton's steady voice making the same vows, and felt the world shift fundamentally beneath her feet. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Colton kissed her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the desperate circumstances, and Vivian tasted possibility mixed with terror. They emerged into afternoon sunlight as husband and wife, bound by law and desperation, and something neither of them was quite ready to name. Mrs. Michaels pressed the marriage certificate into Vivian's hands with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes. The name hit Vivian like a physical shock. Mrs. Hayes. No longer Calder, no longer running for Marcus's debts under someone else's identity. Hayes. Colton's name, Colton's protection, Colton's life tangled irrevocably with her own. Thank you, she managed, voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite identify. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but Colton's hand found hers as they crested the ridge, squeezing hard. No regrets? Vivian looked at the valley spread before them, at the ranch house and barn and the life Colton had built with stubborn determination. Looked at the man beside her who'd chosen to fight for her when abandonment would have been easier. Thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, lying, certain she'd never find anywhere worth staying, and the woman she was becoming, stronger, honest, willing to stand and fight instead of run. No regrets, she said, and meant it. When Blackwell arrived at sunset, he found them waiting on the porch, not as employer and employee, not as rancher and fraud, but as husband and wife presenting a united front. The marriage certificate lay on the table between them like a declaration of war. Blackwell's face went pale as he read it, then flushed dark with fury. This changes nothing. The debt still exists, but the debtor has changed, Colton said calmly. Vivian's debts are now marital property, which means any claim against her is a claim against me, against Iron Creek Ranch. That requires different legal proceedings entirely, ones that will take months and require proof that the debt wasn't fraudulently induced in the first place. You can't. This is... Blackwell sputtered, fury stealing eloquence. We just did. You want to pursue this? You file proper claims through territorial court. Get a judge to hear your case. Prove the debt's legitimacy under scrutiny. Colton's smile held no warmth. Or you can go back to St. Louis and find easier prey. For a long moment, Blackwell simply stared at them, face twisted with rage and disbelief. Then he grabbed the certificate, crumpling it in white-knuckled fury. This isn't over. You think marriage protects you, but I'll find a way. I'm sure you'll try. Colton stood, and his voice dropped to something cold and final. But you're trespassing on my property, threatening my wife, and I'm done being patient. You have 10 seconds to get on that horse and leave. After that, I stop being civilized. The threat carried absolute conviction, and Blackwell, calculating predatory Blackwell, finally recognized he'd lost this round. He mounted with jerky movements, threw the crumpled certificate at their feet, and galloped into gathering darkness, trailing curses and promises of vengeance. Silence settled over the yard like snow, and Vivian realized she was trembling. Not from fear this time, but from the sheer magnitude of what they'd just done. They'd bought time, built a defense, transformed her from isolated prey into protected partner. But they'd also bound themselves together in ways that couldn't be easily undone, ways that made Vivian's pulse race with something that had nothing to do with legal strategy. Colton's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close against the evening cold. Well, Mrs. Hayes, that's quite a first day of marriage. Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the impossible complications, Vivian felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep. I've had worse. That's a low bar. It's the bar I've got. She leaned into his warmth, letting herself take comfort she'd never thought to find. Thank you. For fighting, for everything. We're partners now. Fighting's part of the deal. His hand squeezed her shoulder. Come on, let's go inside. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. They walked into the house together, leaving the crumpled certificate in the snow where Blackwell had thrown it, evidence of the battle they'd won, and the war still waiting to be fought. The first night as husband and wife passed in careful navigation of new territory, neither of them had mapped. Colton insisted Vivian keep her room, maintaining the propriety they'd promised despite the marriage certificate now filed with the territorial office. But something had shifted fundamentally between them. The air felt charged with unspoken possibilities, weighted with the reality that, legal arrangement or not, they'd bound themselves together in ways that went deeper than strategy. Vivian lay awake, listening to the house settle, hearing Colton's footsteps pause outside her door before continuing to his own room. The restraint felt both respectful and agonizing, and she found herself wanting to call out to him, to bridge the careful distance he was maintaining. But fear held her silent. Fear that speaking her feelings aloud would make them too real, too vulnerable, too much like the desperate love that had destroyed her once before. Morning arrived with Raphael's return, his horse lathered from hard riding and his face split with a grin that suggested good news. "Diego found something," he announced, bursting into the kitchen where Vivian and Colton sat over coffee, carefully not touching despite sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. "The promissory note Blackwell's using as evidence. It's got problems. Big ones." Colton set down his cup with controlled urgency. "What kind of problems?" "The signature authentication is questionable. Diego says the notary seal doesn't match territorial records for the date claimed, and the witness signatures can't be verified because one of them died 2 years before the document was supposedly signed." Raphael pulled out a sheaf of papers covered in legal annotations. "It might be a forgery, or at least altered after the fact. Either way, it's not solid enough to hold up under real scrutiny." Vivian felt hope flare sharp and hot in her chest. So the debt claim could be invalidated? Maybe. Diego's filing a motion to challenge the document's authenticity. But here's the thing. Even if we prove it's fraudulent, Blackwell's original debts still exist. They're just harder to enforce without that note. Raphael's expression turned serious. And men like Blackwell don't give up easy. If legal routes fail, he might try something more direct. "Let him try." Colton's voice carried cold certainty. "We're ready this time." But ready or not, the days that followed felt like living on a knife's edge. Blackwell made no direct moves, but his presence haunted the periphery. Glimpses in town, reports from neighbors of strangers asking questions. The constant awareness that he was circling, waiting for an opening. Colton hired 2 additional ranch hands, many trusted who could handle both cattle work and trouble if it came to violence. The ranch took on the feeling of a fortress preparing for siege. Through it all, Vivian and Colton danced around the growing reality of their marriage. They worked side by side during the day, her managing accounts while he handled livestock, coordinating with the practiced ease of people who understood each other's rhythms. They shared meals, conversation, comfortable silences that felt more intimate than any physical touch. But the nights remained separate, each of them retreating to their own rooms with the careful distance of people terrified of wanting too much. It was Sarah Porter who finally called out the obvious. She appeared at the ranch one afternoon under the pretense of returning borrowed books, but her sharp eyes took in the careful way Vivian and Colton moved around each other, orbiting close but never quite touching, and her mouth quirked with knowing amusement. "So," she said once Colton had excused himself to check on the horses, leaving the women alone with tea and awkward silence. "How's married life treating you?" Vivian focused intently on her cup. "It's fine. Everything's fine." "You're a terrible liar. I've told you that before." Sarah leaned forward, voice gentle. "Vivian, you married a good man who clearly cares about you. Why are you both acting like strangers sharing a house?" "Because it was a legal arrangement. Protection, not romance." "And you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore." The admission came out raw and honest. 6 months ago, I was running from debts with a dead man's name in my pocket. Now I'm married to someone I barely know, someone who should hate me for all the lies I told, and I'm so terrified of ruining this that I can barely breathe. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "You think if you want it too much, it'll be taken away. Everything else has been. Then maybe it's time to stop running from good things just because you're scared of losing them." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Colton Hayes doesn't strike me as a man who does anything halfway. If he married you, legal arrangement or not, there was more behind it than strategy. Give him a chance to show you. Give yourself a chance to believe it." The words stayed with Vivian long after Sarah left, echoing through the careful silence she and Colton had constructed. That evening, she found him on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and instead of retreating to her separate space, she settled beside him. "Can I ask you something?" Colton glanced at her, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Always." "Why did you really marry me? And don't say legal protection. There were other ways to buy time, other strategies that didn't require—" She gestured between them. "This." He was silent for a long moment, staring at the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice came low and careful, like a man handling something fragile. You want the truth? I always want the truth. From you especially. I married you because the thought of losing you was worse than any complication marriage could bring. Because somewhere between that first blizzard and Lucha's baby and 100 small moments in between, you stopped being the woman who lied to me and became someone I couldn't imagine this life without. He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his pale eyes stole her breath. I married you because I was already halfway in love with you, and legal protection was just an excuse to make it real. The confession hung in the cold air between them, brave and terrifying. Vivienne felt tears burn hot behind her eyes as something in her chest cracked open. All the walls she'd built against wanting too much, against believing she deserved good things, against letting herself love someone who might actually love her back. I'm scared, she whispered. I'm so scared of this. Of you. Of wanting something I'll just destroy like I destroyed everything else. You didn't destroy anything. You survived. There's a difference. Colton reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with gentle certainty. And you're not alone in being scared. I'm terrified too, but I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone. The words broke something fundamental in Vivienne's resistance, and she found herself leaning into him, letting his arm come around her shoulders, accepting the comfort and connection she'd been denying herself. They sat together as darkness settled over the valley, not speaking, just being, two damaged people choosing to build something new from the wreckage of their separate pasts. I think I'm falling in love with you too, Vivienne finally said, voice barely above a whisper. And it's the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. Colton's arm tightened around her. Good. We'll be terrified together. The next morning brought the confrontation they'd been bracing for, but it came from an unexpected direction. Vivienne was working in the office when she heard shouting from the yard. Not Blackwell's cultured Eastern accent, but something rougher, more desperate. She rushed to the window and felt ice flood her veins. 2 of Blackwell's men had arrived, but they weren't here on his orders. They were running from them. Mr. Hayes, the larger of the 2 men called out as Colton emerged from the barn, hand already on his sidearm. We need to talk. About Blackwell. Talk from there, Colton ordered, voice hard. And keep your hands where I can see them. We're not here to fight. We're here to warn you. The man held up empty palms in a gesture of peace. Blackwell's planning something. Tonight. He's got 6 more men coming from Helena, and they're not here to file legal papers. Vivienne's heart kicked into her throat as she processed the implications. 6 men plus Blackwell meant a small army, and men didn't bring that kind of force for legal negotiations. Why tell us? Colton's suspicion was palpable even from inside the house. Because we signed on to collect a debt, not murder a woman and burn down a ranch. That's what Blackwell's planning, force you off the property, make it look like an accident, and claim the land as debt settlement when you're gone. The man spat in the dirt, disgust twisting his weathered face. We got kids back home. We're not killers. The second man nodded confirmation. They're coming at midnight. Coming hard. You got time to prepare or get out, but either way, they're coming. Raphael appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, face grim. How do we know this isn't a setup? You don't, but I sleep better with a clear conscience than I do with blood money. The first man turned his horse. Do what you want with the warning. We're heading back to Helena and pretending we never met Blackwell. They rode off, leaving Colton and Raphael staring at each other with the same calculation showing in their expressions. Vivienne emerged from the house, fear and fury warring in her chest. This is because of me. He's going to destroy everything because I... Stop. Colton's command cut through her spiraling panic. This is because Blackwell's a bastard who doesn't take no for an answer. But we're not running, and we're not rolling over. It's 6 men, Colton, plus whatever guns Blackwell brings. Then we even the odds. He turned to Raphael. Send riders to the Hendersons, the Fletchers, anyone who owes us favors or values frontier justice. Tell them we've got trouble coming and we need help. And if they don't come, they'll come. People remember who helped them when it mattered. Colton's jaw set with determination. We defended their children in a blizzard, saved Lucia and her baby. This community takes care of its own. Raphael nodded and sprinted toward the stables. Colton turned to Vivienne, and the expression in his eyes was both fierce and gentle. I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to ride to town. Stay with Reverend Michaels until this is over. Don't argue," he added as she opened her mouth to protest. "If this goes bad, I need to know you're safe. Need to fight without worrying about—" His voice caught. "Without worrying about losing you." "And what about me worrying about losing you? I'm hard to kill. Been proving that for 42 years. But the attempt at lightness fell flat, and they both knew it. "Vivian, please, let me protect you this way." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist on staying and fighting beside him, but the fear in his eyes, the real vulnerable terror that something might happen to her, made her understand. This was how he loved her, by making sure she survived even if he didn't. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "Promise me you'll wait for me. Always." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, and full of everything they'd been too scared to say out loud. When they finally broke apart, Vivian tasted salt and realized one of them was crying. Maybe both. "I love you," she said, needing the words spoken before it might be too late. "Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that." "I know. I love you too." Colton pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in like memorizing the moment. "Now go, before I change my mind about being noble." The ride to town felt like fleeing a battlefield, and Vivian's hands shook so badly she could barely hold Dulcie's reins. Behind her, Iron Creek Ranch prepared for war, men gathering, weapons being distributed, defensive positions planned. She'd built a life there from nothing, found family in unlikely people, discovered love in the last place she'd expected, and now it might all burn because of debts and lies that started in a different lifetime. Reverend Michaels took one look at her face and asked no questions, simply led her to a small room and promised she'd be safe. His wife brought tea that Vivian couldn't drink, made comforting sounds that couldn't penetrate the terror coating her thoughts. As darkness fell over Iron Creek and the town settled into uneasy sleep, Vivian sat at the window watching the direction of the ranch and praying to forces she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, praying that Colton's faith in his community wasn't misplaced, praying that good men with righteous cause could stand against predators with numbers and weapons, praying that she hadn't just sent the man she loved to die, protecting a life she'd built on lies. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock, 2. No gunfire echoed across the valley, no flames lit the distant sky, but the silence felt more ominous than violence, like the world holding its breath. It was nearly 3 in the morning when hoofbeats thundered into town and Vivian's heart leapt into her throat. She rushed to the window and saw Colton dismounting, alive and whole, and striding toward the Reverend's house with Raphael beside him. She met them at the door, launching herself at Colton with enough force to make him stumble. He caught her, held her tight enough to hurt, and she felt the tension draining from his body like he'd been holding himself together through pure will until this moment. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling back to check him for injuries she couldn't see. "We were ready, and so were 20 other men from Iron Creek and the surrounding ranches." Colton's voice carried exhausted triumph. "Blackwell rode in with his 6 guns expecting to find us sleeping. Instead, he found a small army waiting. We gave him a choice: leave Montana tonight or face frontier justice come morning." "And?" "He left, took his men, and rode for Helena within the hour. Raphael confirmed they boarded the eastbound train." Colton's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears she hadn't known she was shedding. "It's over, Vivian. He's gone." "But the debt, the legal claims." Diego filed the motion challenging the promissory note. With Blackwell fleeing the territory, it's basically an admission that he knew the document wouldn't survive scrutiny. The judge dismissed the case this afternoon. Raphael's grin split his weathered face. "You're free, both of you." The words took a moment to penetrate, to transform from sounds into meaning. Free. No more debts hanging over her head like executioner's blade. No more running. No more looking over her shoulder for men climbing fire escapes or circling like wolves. I can't." Vivian's voice broke as the magnitude hit her. 6 months of terror, 3 years of Marcus's debts, a lifetime of feeling hunted, all of it ending in a single night of frontier justice and community standing together. "Breathe," Colton said gently, pulling her close again. "It's over. You're safe. You're home." Home. The word settled into her chest like a benediction, like absolution for every lie and desperate choice that had brought her here. Iron Creek Ranch wasn't where she'd intended to land, but somewhere in the blizzards and births and quiet mornings, it had become exactly where she belonged. The ride back to the ranch as dawn painted the sky felt like returning from war. Vivian sat pressed against Colton's side, his arms secure around her waist, and watched the valley emerge from darkness into light. The ranch house appeared on the horizon unchanged, untouched by the violence that had threatened it, and something in Vivian's chest finally unclenched. The men who'd stood with them were already dispersing, neighbors heading back to their own ranches, satisfied that justice had been served and one of their own protected. Mrs. Fletcher pressed a basket of fresh bread into Vivian's hands with tears in her eyes. "You saved my children," she said simply. "We don't forget that kind of debt." Henderson gripped Colton's shoulder with rough affection. "Good fight. Damn good fight." One by one they left until only Colton, Vivian, and Raphael remained in the yard as full sunrise broke over the mountains. "I'll handle the morning chores," Raphael said with a knowing grin. "You two look like you could use some rest." He disappeared into the barn, leaving them alone in the golden light. Colton turned to Vivian, and the expression in his eyes held question and hope and careful vulnerability. "So, Mrs. Hayes, what happens now?" Vivian thought about the woman who'd arrived 6 months ago in silk and terror, certain she'd never find anywhere worth staying. Thought about the woman she'd become through storms and births, and the patient grace of a man who'd called her brave. Thought about the future spreading before them like the Montana sky, vast and challenging and full of possibility. Now? She reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble and strong jaw, and the warmth of skin against her palm. "Now we stop pretending this is just a legal arrangement. Now we build something real." "Something real," Colton repeated, like testing the words. "I can do real." His arms came around her, pulling her close. "Question is, can you? Because I'm not good at halfway, Vivian. You choose this. Choose me. It's for keeps." "Good. Because I'm tired of running, tired of being scared of wanting things." She stood on her toes to kiss him, soft and sure. "I choose you. I choose this. For keeps." The kiss deepened, 6 months of careful distance and growing feelings finally breaking free. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colton rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home," he whispered. "I've been home for a while," Vivian said. "I was just too stubborn to admit it." They walked into the house together, leaving the door open behind them because there was nothing left to hide from, nothing left to fear. The morning stretched ahead with all the mundane tasks of ranch life: animals to feed, accounts to balance, fences to mend. But underneath the ordinary rhythms lay something extraordinary: the knowledge that they'd fought for this life and won, that they'd chosen each other not from desperation but from love. The weeks that followed settled into new patterns. Vivian moved her belongings into Colton's room, not because propriety demanded it, but because sleeping separate felt absurd when they'd already bound their lives together in every way that mattered. They worked side by side during the day, shared meals and conversation, and the comfortable intimacy of people learning each other's rhythms. At night, Colton would pull her close, and they'd talk about everything and nothing: plans for expanding the herd, memories from before they'd met, dreams for the future they were building together. Raphael brought Lucia and baby Diego to visit, and Vivian held the child she'd helped bring into the world, while his mother told stories about midnight feedings and first smiles. The weight of the infant in her arms stirred something fierce and tender in her chest, and she caught Colton watching her with an expression that suggested he was thinking about futures that included more than just the two of them. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing the brutal cold Colton had warned about. But inside the ranch house, warmth built from more than just the fireplace. Vivian discovered she had a talent for frontier cooking when necessity forced her to learn, and Colton proved surprisingly patient about the meals that didn't quite work out. They weathered their first real argument, something about supply orders and stubbornness, and learned how to fight fair and make up thoroughly. On a January evening with snow falling thick outside, Colton found Vivian in the study reviewing accounts and wrapped his arms around her from behind. Come to bed. The numbers will still be there tomorrow. I'm almost finished balancing. Vivian. His voice held amused exasperation. Come to bed. She set down her pen and turned in his arms, struck as always by how much she loved this man. Loved his strength and his stubbornness, and the way he'd fought for her when she barely knew how to fight for herself. Have I told you today that I love you? Twice, but I never get tired of hearing it. Colton pressed a kiss to her forehead. I love you too, even when you're being ridiculous about ledgers. The ledgers are important. We saved 15% on feed costs this year because he silenced her with a kiss that made her forget about percentages and feed costs and everything except the feeling of being held by someone who chose her, who fought for her, who made her believe that maybe she deserved good things after all. Spring arrived with dramatic suddenty, snow melting into rushing creeks and grass surging green across the valley. Vivian stood on the porch one morning watching the land wake up, one hand pressed to her stomach where new life was just beginning to make itself known. She hadn't told Colton yet, wanted to be absolutely certain before speaking the words that would transform them from partners to parents. But as if sensing her thoughts, he appeared beside her and placed his own hand over hers. You gonna tell me, or do I have to guess? She looked up at him, surprise and joy flooding through her. How did you know? I pay attention. You've been different the last few weeks. Softer somehow, more. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something beautiful. More like you're carrying something precious. We're carrying something precious, Vivian corrected, lacing their fingers together. Are you... Is this what I want? Colton pulled her close, his free hand coming up to cradle her face with devastating gentleness. Vivian, I want everything with you, with every season, every challenge, every joy, this baby, our life, all of it. The tears came then, hot and relieved and full of wonder at how completely her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she'd been running from debts with terror dogging every step. Now she stood in the Montana sunrise carrying new life, held by a man who loved her, surrounded by land that felt like home. I'm terrified, she admitted. I don't know how to be a mother. I barely know how to be a wife. What if we figure it out together? Colton's thumb wiped away her tears. What if we stop waiting for disaster and trust that we've earned this happiness, that we've fought hard enough to keep it? The word settled something fundamental in Vivian's chest, some last piece of the frightened woman she'd been finally letting go. She'd survived Marcus's debts and Blackwell's threats, and her own worst mistakes. She'd ridden into blizzards and delivered babies and rebuilt herself from lies into something honest and strong. Maybe that meant she was strong enough for this too, strong enough to be a wife, a mother, a partner in building something that would outlast them both. Together, she agreed, we figure it out together. By the time summer arrived full and hot across the valley, Iron Creek Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt permanent. The herd had expanded with successful spring calving, the accounts showed healthy profits from Vivian's careful management, and the ranch house had begun to accumulate the small touches that transformed it from a bachelor's functional space into a home. Curtains in the windows, flowers on the table, laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. Vivian's pregnancy advanced with surprising ease, her body adapting to the changes with less difficulty than she'd feared. Colton became almost comically protective, insisting she avoid heavy work and rest more, driving her to gentle exasperation and fierce affection in equal measure. I'm pregnant, not dying, she told him one afternoon when he'd actually carried her to the porch to watch the sunset rather than let her walk the 20 feet herself. I know, but you're carrying something more precious than all the cattle in Montana, so humor me. He settled beside her, hand automatically finding her swelling belly. Besides, I like taking care of you. You like controlling things. That too. His grin held no shame. But mostly I like making sure you and this baby are safe. The baby arrived on a September evening with the same dramatic timing that had characterized Vivian's entire Montana experience. The labor came fast and fierce, leaving barely enough time to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Carson, who'd recovered from her earlier illness. Colton stayed through the entire process, despite Mrs. Carson's raised eyebrows, holding Vivian's hand and whispering encouragement through the worst of the pain. When their daughter finally arrived, small and furious and absolutely perfect, Colton wept openly while Vivian laughed through exhausted tears. "She's beautiful," he said, voice thick with wonder as he held the tiny bundle. "She's absolutely beautiful." "She looks like you," Vivian observed, seeing her husband's stubborn chin and pale eyes already evident in the infant's features. "She looks like Hope," Colton corrected, pressing a kiss to his daughter's forehead before carefully placing her in Vivian's arms. "What should we call her?" Vivian studied the tiny face, thought about the journey that had brought her here, the lies and desperation transformed through courage and community into something beautiful and real. Thought about the life they were building together, the future spreading ahead like the Montana sky. "Grace," she said softly. "We'll call her Grace." Years passed the way they do in places where seasons mark time more than calendars. Grace grew into a fierce, stubborn child who inherited her father's determination and her mother's quick mind, who rode almost before she could walk and charmed everyone from Raphael to Mrs. Henderson with her bright laughter. A son followed 2 years later, Daniel, named for Colton's father, and then another daughter 3 years after that. The ranch expanded and prospered under their combined management, Colton's instincts for cattle and land paired with Vivian's financial acumen creating something more successful than either could have built alone. They weathered hard winters and drought summers, celebrated good years and fought through difficult ones, always as partners, always together. Iron Creek, the town, grew around them, transforming from rough frontier settlement into something approaching civilization. The schoolhouse expanded, the church added a bell tower, and the main street gained a proper hotel and a second general store. Vivian continued teaching whenever she could spare time from the ranch, watching generation after generation of children learn their letters under her patient guidance. Sarah Porter married a homesteader from the next valley and became a lifelong friend, someone Vivian could share the small triumphs and frustrations of daily life with. Raphael eventually brought a wife of his own to the ranch, a quiet woman named Isabella, who cooked like magic and gentled even the most difficult horses. The Mendoza family and the Hayes family became something like extended tribe, children growing up together, sharing holidays and hardships, and all the small joys that made frontier life bearable. On an autumn evening 20 years after Vivian first stepped off that train in borrowed identity and silk dress, she stood on the familiar porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Beside her, Colton's hair had gone mostly gray, and his face bore deeper lines, but his eyes still held the same fierce determination that had made him fight for her when abandoning her would have been easier. "You ever regret it?" she asked, slipping her hand into his with the easy comfort of 2 decades of partnership. "Taking a chance on a lying fraud who showed up pretending to be someone else?" "Every single day," Colton said solemnly. Then he grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish. "Regret not doing it sooner. Regret wasting those first weeks being angry instead of seeing what was right in front of me. You needed time to trust me. I needed time to admit I was already falling for you." He pulled her close against the evening chill. "Best mistake I ever made, answering that advertisement. Even if the woman who showed up wasn't who I expected. She was better? She was real. That's what mattered." Colton pressed a kiss to her temple. "Everything else we figured out as we went." Behind them, the house buzzed with the chaos of family, Grace helping her younger siblings with homework, Daniel arguing about ranch chores, the baby of the family demanding attention with the imperious confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love. It was loud and messy and imperfect, and absolutely everything Vivian had never dared to hope for during those desperate days running from Marcus's debts. She'd arrived in Montana with nothing but lies and terror, certain she'd never find anywhere worth staying. She'd found instead a home built from honesty and hard work, a love forged through crisis and choice, a family created not from blood alone, but from the fierce determination to build something good from damaged pieces. Thomas Blackwell was long gone, last heard of in a San Francisco gambling hall where he'd reportedly lost everything to cards and bad decisions. The debts that had driven Vivian west had been settled in territorial court and officially discharged, the fraudulent promissory note exposed and invalidated. Marcus Calder had faded to a distant memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of weak men and desperate choices. But Colton Hayes remained solid and real beside her, and the life they'd built together stood as testament to what was possible when people chose courage over fear, honesty over deception, partnership over isolation. "Come inside," Vivian said, tugging his hand. "Dinner's ready, and Grace made pie. It's probably terrible, but we have to eat it anyway." Sounds perfect." Colton let himself be led toward the warm light and noise of family, pausing at the threshold to look back at the vast Montana sky one last time. Absolutely perfect. And in that moment, standing between the wilderness they'd tamed and the home they'd built, Vivian understood something fundamental. She'd spent so long running from her past that she'd almost missed the future waiting to be claimed, almost let fear steal the possibility of love, almost convinced herself she didn't deserve the grace she'd been offered. But grace, she'd learned, wasn't about deserving. It was about being brave enough to accept it when it appeared, stubborn enough to fight for it when challenged, and wise enough to recognize it in the weathered face of a rancher who'd called her brave when she'd felt like nothing but a coward. She'd arrived as Vivian Calder, fraud and liar running from debts she couldn't pay. She'd become Vivian Hayes, partner and mother and woman who'd learned that strength wasn't about never being broken. It was about choosing to rebuild better and stronger, about trusting that some foundations were worth building on, about believing that sometimes the best things in life came from the places you never intended to go. The Montana Territory had tested her with blizzards and births, with threats and hard choices, and the daily grind of frontier survival. She'd passed those tests not by being perfect, but by being persistent, not by having all the answers, but by being willing to learn, not by doing everything right, but by refusing to give up when things went wrong. And in the end, that had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Inside the house, Grace called for her mother to settle a sibling dispute. Daniel demanded to know if he could take the new horse out tomorrow. The baby shrieked with laughter at something only she understood. Colton squeezed Vivian's hand once more before releasing it, both of them moving into the warm chaos of the life they'd built together. Behind them, the Montana sunset faded into star-bright darkness, and the land stretched vast and challenging and full of promise toward horizons yet to be explored. But for now, for this moment, Vivian Hayes stood exactly where she belonged, in a home earned through honesty, surrounded by love fought for and won, living a life transformed from desperate flight into deliberate choice. The journey from silk-wearing fraud to frontier wife had been brutal and beautiful in equal measure. But she wouldn't change a single step of it, wouldn't trade a single scar or lesson learned. Because every hard mile had led here, to this porch, and this man, and this family, and this vast Montana sky that had witnessed her transformation from woman running from her past to woman building her future, one honest choice at a time. And that, Vivian thought as she followed her family inside and closed the door on the gathering night, was the best ending she could have asked for. Not because it was easy or perfect or free from challenges still to come, but because it was real. As real as Montana winter and summer heat, as real as calloused hands and honest work, as real as the love of a stubborn rancher who'd seen past her lies to the woman she could become and offered her the chance to prove it. She'd taken that chance, and it had changed everything.